1. My name is Leo Miller, and for exactly 11 months, I was the most hated junior at Crestview High School, which is a genuinely impressive achievement when you consider I spent those 11 months doing absolutely nothing except correcting one wrong answer in AP chemistry. That's it. That's the whole crime. One wrong answer, corrected out loud, in front of the wrong girl. If I had known the actual price tag on being right, I would have let Owen Hayes believe that molarity and molality were the same thing until the day he died. But I didn't know, because nobody ever hands you a syllabus for social warfare. So let me back up and tell you how a mildly annoying chemistry fact turned into the worst year of my life, and then, against every possible law of teenage physics, somehow turned into the best one. It started on a Tuesday, which already should have been a warning, because nothing good has ever happened on a Tuesday in the history of the world. Mr. Harrison had written a problem on the board about dilution ratios, and Owen, who had apparently decided that this was the week he'd impress Chloe Peterson with his brain instead of his jawline, raised his hand and confidently announced the wrong formula in front of 31 witnesses. I wasn't trying to humiliate him. I want that on the record immediately, because everyone who tells this story later acts like I stood up on my desk and did a victory lap. I just quietly said, I think you're using molality instead of molarity, because Mr. Harrison looked personally wounded, and I have a pathological need to fix wrongness the way some people have a pathological need to pop bubble wrap. Owen's ears went the color of a stop sign. Chloe Peterson, sitting one row over in a cloud of vanilla perfume and absolute social dominion, did not say anything. She just looked at me. It was a short look, maybe 2 seconds. But I have relived those 2 seconds more times than I've relived my own birthday parties, because that was the look of a queen recalculating the threat level of a peasant she had previously not known existed. I want to be clear that Chloe Peterson had never once acknowledged my presence before that Tuesday. I was furniture to her. I was a background extra in the movie of her junior year. And then I opened my big, stupid, correct mouth, and suddenly I was a plot point. That should have been the end of it. A wrong answer corrected, a teacher mildly pleased, a boy mildly annoyed, life moving on the way it's supposed to. Except at lunch that same day, fate decided one humiliation wasn't a proper season finale, so it added a second one for free. I was carrying my tray past the senior tables, doing the careful, weighted blanket walk you do when you're holding a bowl of soup you already regret ordering, and somebody's foot found my ankle. I have never determined with total certainty whether it was Owen's foot on purpose or just Owen's foot existing in a hallway the way Owen's foot tends to exist, sprawled out like he owns the floor tile personally. What I do know is that I went down like a folding chair at a wedding reception, soup first, dignity a distant second, and by the time I hit the linoleum, there were already 4 phones out filming it. 4. I counted later in the video because apparently I needed to relive the exact geometry of my own disaster from multiple camera angles, like a football referee reviewing a controversial call. Somebody added a slide whistle sound effect within the hour. Somebody added a caption that said, "Bro really tried to become the soup." By the end of 7th period, it had a remix with a laugh track, and by the time I got home, it had made its way onto the class meme page with 341 likes, which, for a school of about 900 people, is basically a national holiday of humiliation. I want to skip ahead here because the next 2 weeks were just a slow, dull hum of being a punchline. People I had literally never spoken to made soup jokes at my locker. Someone taped a plastic spoon to the outside of my backpack. It wasn't violent, it wasn't dramatic, it was just this low, constant, itchy static of being the joke of the month. And I genuinely thought that was the worst of it. That this was as bad as it would get. A soup video and some spoon-based cruelty, and then everyone would get bored and move on to somebody else's humiliation, because that's usually how it works. It is not, in fact, how it worked, and the reason I know that is because of a phone number typo that changed my entire life, and I need you to understand that I am not exaggerating that sentence even slightly. Here's what I didn't know at the time. Chloe Peterson and her extremely loyal, extremely bored inner circle had, the previous spring, run a group chat called The Cellar, which existed for exactly one purpose, which was making fun of whoever had been unlucky enough to become the class's temporary main character of shame that week. The Cellar got shut down in April when a screenshot leaked to a teacher, and half the group got a stern talking to and a permanent note in a file somewhere, And Chloe, being nothing if not resilient in exactly the wrong direction, spent her entire summer vacation planning its sequel. She called it The Basement, because apparently subtlety died with the cellar, and she built the invite list from an old contact sheet the front office hands out every September so kids can coordinate on group projects. The same one that lists every homeroom student alphabetically by last name, with their phone numbers next to little cartoon mascot icons like it's a summer camp roster. Somewhere between Colby and Dawson, her thumb slipped. She meant to add a kid named Caleb Dawson, a junior 2 homerooms over who had been peripherally connected to some other minor drama the year before. She added me instead, Leo Miller. 1 letter, 6 numbers off, and an entire secret universe of my own destruction accidentally unlocked itself onto my phone like a cursed advent calendar. I didn't even notice for 2 days because my phone was on silent for a chemistry test, which is a detail I will never stop being furious about, since it means I spent 48 hours being roasted in real time by people who smiled at me in the hallway, and I was blissfully, stupidly unaware, eating cereal, doing my homework, living my one precious normal life, while somewhere in the digital dark, 32 of my classmates were workshopping soup puns about me like it was their thesis defense. I found it during an assembly, a boring one, the kind where the vice principal reads attendance policy updates in a voice clearly designed to induce a coma, and I pulled out my phone under the desk the way you do when survival requires distraction, and there it was, sitting at the bottom of my notifications like a landmine with a little chat bubble icon. The Basement. 47 unread messages. I remember thinking genuinely, oh, is this some club thing? Some student council subcommittee I forgot I signed up for, because my brain, bless it, is constitutionally incapable of assuming the worst about anything until the worst is staring directly at it wearing a name tag. I opened it. I am going to try to describe what it feels like to scroll up through a group chat and watch, in real time, the private opinions of 32 people you go to school with every single day. And the closest comparison I can offer is that it is exactly like reading your own eulogy while you're still alive, except the eulogy is being crowdsourced by people who are also making fun of your funeral outfit. There were message chains from months ago, before I was even in the chat, full of jokes about other kids, kids who had graduated, kids who had transferred, kids whose worst humiliations were apparently permanent digital artifacts now, preserved forever in a group chat like fossils in amber. And then, starting 3 weeks ago, right around the time Owen's ears turned into a stop sign, my name started appearing. Leo thinks he's so smart. Leo really said that with his whole chest, LOL. Did anyone else see the soup thing? I'm actually crying. Somebody had made a poll, an actual poll with little bar graphs titled, "How many more days until Leo cries in the bathroom?" with options ranging from, "He already has to give him a week." 41 people had voted on my emotional collapse like it was a fantasy football bracket. I sat there in that dark auditorium with the vice principal's voice droning about tardy slips somewhere very far away. And I scrolled, and scrolled, and scrolled. And the strange thing, the thing I didn't expect, was that it wasn't even the cruelty that got me first. It was the volume of it. It was realizing that this had been happening constantly, daily, sometimes hourly. This whole invisible second cafeteria running underneath the real one, where a huge chunk of my grade had apparently decided I was the day's entertainment, and I had walked through all of it smiling at people, saying good morning to people, sitting 2 seats away from people in English class, with absolutely no idea that half of them were mentally screenshotting my every move for later commentary. I want to tell you I had some dignified reaction. I did not. I sat in that auditorium chair with my stomach doing something between falling and folding, and I genuinely considered, for about 4 full seconds, walking directly out of that assembly, out of the building, and just not coming back, transferring schools, changing my name, moving to a cabin, becoming a hermit who identifies birds for a living. And then, scrolling further up, past another wave of soup jokes, past a screenshot someone had taken of my Instagram bio because apparently that was also fair game, I noticed something odd. Something that snagged in my brain like a splinter and would not let go for the next 6 weeks. Every single message in that chat, every joke, every poll, every cruel little observation got reactions. Laughing emojis stacked 5 deep under the meanest ones, thumbs up, the occasional skull emoji for the ones people found especially savage. Reactions from Chloe, reactions from Owen, reactions from Anya Gupta, who had lent me a pencil that very morning with what I would have sworn was a completely normal, non-hateful smile. Reactions from Marco Santos, who high-fived me after gym class like we were something resembling friends. Reactions from basically everyone on basically everything, except one account. One single member of that chat, saved in the group under no name at all, just a small circular avatar that was a plain black heart emoji on a gray background, had never once typed a single word into the basement. Not one message, going all the way back to April, all the way back to whatever conversations had spilled over from the old cellar chat before it got shut down. No jokes, no polls, no commentary, nothing. But scrolling through those months of cruelty, I noticed the black heart showed up again and again in one very specific place. Not laughing under the jokes, not thumbs-upping the polls. Every single time, without exception, the meanest message in any given conversation, the one that crossed some invisible line, even by that chat's absolutely subterranean standards, got exactly one reaction from the black heart. Always the same one. Always a small, silent, gray little heart, sitting there under the ugliest sentence in the thread, like a tiny flag planted on a battlefield nobody else could see. It wasn't laughing. It wasn't celebrating. If I had to put a word to it, and I spent a genuinely embarrassing number of nights trying to, it looked like witnessing. Like someone was quietly raising their hand in a burning building to say, "I saw this happen," without ever once being brave enough, or safe enough, or something enough to say it out loud where anyone could trace it back to them. I did not solve this mystery that night. I want to be honest about the timeline here because in every version of this story that got repeated around school later, I apparently cracked the case in about 10 minutes like some kind of teen detective, and that is not remotely what happened. What happened is I closed my phone, sat through the rest of an assembly I couldn't tell you a single word of, went home, told my mother I had a headache, which was true in the sense that my entire skull felt like it had been microwaved, and then spent the next several days in a fog so thick my little sister Lily asked me twice if I was becoming a robot, because apparently that's what 12-year-olds call it when your face stops making expressions. My mom, Sarah Miller, who has a superhuman ability to detect emotional weather fronts from 3 rooms away, eventually cornered me in the kitchen on a Thursday and asked, very casually, while pretending to organize the spice rack, whether something was going on at school. I told her no. I have never in my life been a convincing liar, and she has never in her life accepted the word no as a complete answer. But she also has the wisdom to know when pushing gets you further information versus when it just gets you a slammed door. So she let it go, and instead just left a plate of the good cookies, the ones normally reserved for holidays, sitting on my desk that night without comment. My dad, David Miller, who processes emotional distress primarily through home improvement projects, spent that entire weekend re-caulking the bathroom and occasionally shouting encouraging non-sequiturs up the stairs like, "You're a good kid, Leo," apropos of absolutely nothing, which is somehow exactly the right amount of support for a man who communicates love almost entirely in silicone sealant. I didn't tell either of them about the basement. I don't fully know why, even now. Some combination of shame and the specific teenage certainty that adults, even good ones, even ones who love you, cannot actually fix the particular flavor of humiliation available only at your own school, among your own people, inside your own phone. What I did instead, because apparently my coping mechanism under extreme duress is turning into a small forensic accountant, was open a blank document on my laptop and start building a list. I titled it, with the kind of pathetic optimism that only exists at 11 at night, Operation Blackheart, and then immediately felt embarrassed enough by the title that I renamed it Chem Notes, so my search history would have plausible deniability. My method was not sophisticated. I want to lower expectations immediately for anyone hoping for a thrilling hacker montage, because what I actually did was scroll back through 11 months of a group chat, cross-referencing every single message the Blackheart account had reacted to against who was present, absent, online, or mentioned in class that day, using nothing but the school's shared Google Calendar of assembly schedules and an unreasonable amount of stubbornness. The first thing I noticed was that the account had been active in the chat since at least February of last year, which meant whoever this was had survived the cellar too, the previous incarnation of this exact horror show, and had simply migrated silently into its sequel like a ghost haunting a house that got sold to new owners. That detail mattered more than I initially gave it credit for. My first suspect, embarrassingly, was Anya Gupta, mostly because Anya had a habit of going quiet in class in a way I had always read as thoughtful, and now, paranoid and sleep-deprived, I was reading as guilty. I spent 2 days building an entire conspiracy theory around Anya, lending me that pencil out of some complicated guilt-driven kindness, before I actually sat next to her at a lab station on Wednesday and, in the most casual voice I could fake, mentioned offhand that I'd heard some people made a group chat about the soup thing. Anya's face did not do the thing a secretly guilty person's face does. It did the thing a person's face does when they are hearing genuinely upsetting news for the first time, going pale and asking, with real alarm, "Wait, what group chat? Who's in it?" And then spending the rest of the period looking so distractedly furious on my behalf that I felt like the worst kind of garbage for ever suspecting her. Anya was out. My second suspect was Marco Santos, mostly because Marco was quiet in a completely different way. The way big guys get quiet when they've decided the safest move in any social situation is to just not have opinions out loud, which, in my exhausted, over-caffeinated theorizing, I had somehow twisted into evidence of secret guilt rather than evidence of a guy who mostly wanted to talk about baseball and be left alone. I ruled Marco out by accident, honestly, when I noticed the Black Heart account had reacted to a message sent at exactly 7:58 in the morning. And I happened to know, because our lockers are 3 apart, that Marco has 0-period weight training every single day and does not so much as glance at his phone before 9. Marco was out. By this point, I had burned through basically every name I could think of who fit some vague profile of quiet but present, and I was staring down the humiliating possibility that I would simply never know, that this would just live in my head forever as an unsolved case, when I did the one obvious thing I should have done from day one, which was pull up the actual homeroom contact sheet, the same one that had gotten me into this mess to begin with, and cross-reference the phone number attached to the Black Heart's contact card, because the front office, in a rare act of accidental heroism, lists every student's number right there in a PDF that gets emailed to every parent in September, whether they want it or not. It took me 4 minutes. The number belonged to a kid named Mateo Garcia. I sat there staring at the screen for a genuinely long time, because Mateo Garcia was, and I say this with zero cruelty intended, the single most unremarkable presence in our entire homeroom. He sat in the back corner by the window, drew constantly in a sketchbook he never showed anyone, answered exactly the minimum number of questions required to avoid teacher attention, and had, as far as I could recall from an entire year and a half of sharing a room with him, said maybe 40 total words to me in my presence, most of them some variation of, "Can I borrow a pencil?" which, given everything, felt suddenly loaded with irony I did not have the emotional bandwidth to process. I did not confront him immediately. I want to be honest that my first instinct was not some noble march toward truth. It was 3 days of intense, paralyzed overthinking. Because what exactly do you say to someone, "Hey, I noticed you've been the only person not actively enjoying my public humiliation. Thanks, I guess. Please don't be weird about it." Every version of that sentence sounded insane in my head. What finally moved me was, of all things, art class, which I only took because it fulfilled an elective requirement and I had heard the teacher gave easy grades. Mateo sat 2 tables over, headphones in, sketching something I couldn't see, and about halfway through the period our teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, made everyone pass their sketchbooks 1 seat to the right for a peer feedback exercise, which is the kind of activity that exists specifically to torture introverts. And through the shuffle, Mateo's sketchbook landed, by pure administrative chance, directly in front of me. I was not going to look. I want that on the record. But it fell open, right there on the desk, to a page near the middle, and before I could look away out of basic decency, I saw it. A small, careful, inked drawing in the corner of an otherwise unrelated page. A tiny black heart, the exact same shape, the exact same weight of line as the little gray avatar sitting silently at the bottom of a chat that had spent 11 months trying to break me. I closed the sketchbook immediately, my hands actually shaking a little, and passed it back down the row without a word. And Mateo, oblivious, just kept drawing with his headphones in, completely unaware that I had just accidentally solved the one mystery I'd spent 3 weeks failing to crack through actual detective work, purely by an art teacher's seating logistics. I didn't say anything to him that day, or the next day. I want to be honest that I chickened out twice, walking up to his locker with some opening line rehearsed in my head, and then just veering off at the last second to pretend I needed a water fountain I did not need, drinking approximately 4 unnecessary gulps of water while my heart hammered like I was about to rob a bank instead of talk to the quietest kid in homeroom. What finally got me to actually do it was, embarrassingly, my little sister Lily, who at 12 years old possesses more emotional intelligence than most adults I know. I hadn't told her anything specific, but she'd clearly clocked that something was wrong, the way siblings do, through some kind of osmotic radar for misery, and one night over dinner, apropos of nothing, she said, "You know how in group projects there's always one kid who doesn't say anything but does all the actual work quietly in the background, and everyone forgets to thank them?" And I nearly choked on a green bean, because I hadn't told her a single detail, and she had somehow, through pure 12-year-old instinct, described exactly the shape of the thing I'd been circling for weeks. The next morning, I got to homeroom early, deliberately early, 10 minutes before the bell, which required an act of willpower normally reserved for dentist appointments, and Mateo was already there, back corner, window seat, sketchbook out, headphones in, same as always. I sat down in the empty seat next to him, which I had never once done in a year and a half of sharing a room, and he glanced up, clearly surprised, pulling one headphone out with the wary, blinking look of someone who has spent a long time assuming that people only approach him when they want something or are about to make fun of something. I didn't have a smooth opening line prepared, despite 3 days of rehearsal, so what actually came out of my mouth was, and I quote myself with real embarrassment here, "Hey, this is going to sound insane, but do you draw a small black heart in the corner of your sketchbook pages sometimes?" Mateo went very, very still. It's the specific stillness of someone doing rapid internal math about how much trouble they're in. And for one terrible second, I thought he was going to deny it, or worse, get up and walk away, and the whole thing would just end there in an awkward homeroom silence forever. Instead, he closed his sketchbook slowly, looked at me for a long moment like he was deciding something, and said quietly, so quietly I had to lean in slightly to catch it under the ambient hum of 30 kids finding their seats, "You found the basement." It wasn't a question. I nodded. He exhaled, this long, slow breath like he'd been holding it since April, and said, "I've been waiting a year for someone to actually notice, and I genuinely didn't think it would be you." We ended up skipping the last 5 minutes of homeroom, standing by the water fountain in the hallway where nobody else could hear us, and Mateo told me the whole thing in this flat, careful voice, like he'd rehearsed it in his head so many times the emotion had worn smooth, the way a stone gets smooth from a river running over it for 100 years. Last year, he said, during the spring of freshman year, he'd been the one in the cellar, the original chat, the one that got shut down. Somebody had found an old video of him crying at a 6th grade sleepover. Some genuinely nothing moment, a kid being homesick and 11 and briefly sad about his parents' divorce. And it had gotten passed around with a caption calling him a baby. And for about 2 months, he'd been the joke of his own grade in exactly the way I was becoming the joke of mine. Except nobody had accidentally added him to the chat where it was all happening. He'd found out about it the hard way, from a kid laughing at him in gym class and refusing to explain why, until 3 other kids explained it for him, gleefully, like they were doing him a favor. He told a teacher. The teacher was Ms. Castillo, our school counselor, who took it seriously, got the chat shut down, got a handful of kids a stern talking to, and Mateo assumed, being 12 and hopeful in the specific way you only get to be once, that this meant it was over, that justice had been done, that the machine had been switched off for good. What actually happened, he said, his voice going flatter, was that within about 3 weeks, the exact same group of kids quietly rebuilt themselves into a new chat that excluded him specifically, so he'd have no way to report it again. And Ms. Castillo, despite being genuinely good at her job, had no way to police something she couldn't see. And the kids who ran it learned an extremely valuable and extremely bad lesson, which is that cruelty works better when it's invisible to the exact people who might stop it. So he'd made himself a rule, he told me, staring at the water fountain instead of at me. The kind of rule you make when you're 12 and powerless and need to feel like you're doing something instead of nothing. He would never leave a chat like that again, no matter how badly he wanted to, because leaving meant losing the ability to see what was happening, and seeing, even silently, even uselessly, felt like the only form of resistance available to him. And he would never react to a cruel message with anything that looked like approval, obviously. But he also refused to just scroll past in total silence, because total silence felt too much like consent. So he picked one reaction, the black heart, and used it, and only it, every single time a message crossed a line he'd privately drawn for himself. A small, quiet, deniable flag that meant, in a language only he understood, I saw this, and it was wrong, and I am marking it down somewhere that isn't inside my own head where I can pretend I imagined it. And then, almost as an afterthought, in a voice that had gone even quieter, he said he also took screenshots. Time-stamped, saved to a folder on his laptop labeled, with a bleakness that made me want to hug him and also made me laugh, School Photos, 2024. Because nobody snoops through a folder that boring-sounding. Every single message that got a black heart from him also existed permanently, dated, screenshotted, in that folder. Because if it ever escalated past jokes, if it ever turned into something that actually hurt someone in a way that couldn't be walked back, he wanted proof that would hold up. Proof that couldn't be denied or deleted or explained away as just kids joking around. The exact kind of proof he'd never had for himself back in 8th grade. I stood there by that water fountain for a long moment, just processing the sheer, quiet, unglamorous bravery of that. Because it would have been so much easier, so much less lonely, for Mateo to just leave the chat and never look back. And instead, he'd spent an entire additional year voluntarily sitting inside a room full of people who'd once done to him exactly what they were now doing to me, just so that somebody, someday, might have evidence. I asked him, kind of stupidly, why me? Why now, after a whole year of watching this happen to other kids and staying invisible? And he looked at me for a second like the answer was obvious and said, honestly, I don't know. Maybe because you corrected Owen without even looking smug about it, you just looked embarrassed that you'd said anything at all. And I thought, that kid's about to get flattened for being right, and nobody deserves that. And then I felt bad for thinking it and doing nothing, same as always. And then you sat down next to me this morning and asked about the heart. And honestly, I've genuinely never been so relieved and so terrified at the same time in my whole life. I didn't say anything smooth back. I said thank you, which felt wildly insufficient for what he'd just told me, and then, because my brain apparently needed to fill silence with something, I asked if I could see the screenshot folder, and he actually laughed, this small, surprised huff of a laugh, like it was the first time anyone had asked him something so straightforwardly practical, instead of either ignoring the whole thing or making it a very serious, emotional moment. And he said, yeah, actually come over after school. I think you're going to want to see all of it. That was, as far as I'm concerned, the actual first day of our friendship, even though on paper it was the day I discovered a folder of evidence documenting 11 months of my own public humiliation, which is not exactly how friendships are supposed to start according to any movie I've ever seen. Mateo lived about 15 minutes from school in a small apartment above a dry cleaner, the kind of place where you can smell the steam from the presses downstairs drifting faintly through the floorboards. And his mom, Sofia Garcia, worked 2 jobs, days at a dental office front desk and some nights doing invoicing for a catering company, which meant the apartment was usually quiet and empty in the after-school hours, which Mateo said, without any obvious self-pity, just as a fact, was actually kind of nice, because it meant nobody asked him why he was drawing again instead of doing something more productive. His room was small and covered, genuinely covered, walls and all, in sketches, some finished, most half done, mostly of things you wouldn't expect from a kid who barely said 40 words a year to anyone. Incredibly detailed dragons, spaceship interiors, a truly extraordinary rendering of our own cafeteria reimagined as some kind of medieval banquet hall. And I stood in the doorway for a solid minute just turning slowly, taking it in, before Mateo, looking almost bashful, said, sorry, it's a lot, I know. And I told him with total honesty that it was the single coolest room I'd ever been inside, which was true, and also apparently the correct thing to say, because something in his shoulders loosened that had clearly been tense since roughly homeroom that morning. We spent the next 2 hours going through his folder together, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor with his laptop between us, and it was, I want to be honest, a genuinely strange emotional experience, laughing at some of the sheer pettiness on display. The poll about my bathroom crying schedule, an unhinged 3-message debate about whether my haircut counted as a cry for help, while also feeling this slow, cold recognition build in my chest at just how organized, how patient, how deliberate the cruelty had actually been. Not chaotic teenage meanness, but something closer to a hobby, maintained carefully over months by people with apparently nothing better to do with their one wild and precious adolescence. What surprised me most, going through it with Mateo narrating context I hadn't had access to before, was how uneven the participation actually was. Chloe and Owen drove almost everything. A genuinely staggering percentage of the ugliest messages traced back to just the two of them. But a huge number of the other 30 accounts, I started noticing, mostly just reacted, or said nothing at all. Present in the chat the way you're present at a party you don't actually want to be at, but are too anxious to leave. And a handful, including, weirdly, a kid named Mei Lin, who I'd always assumed was one of Chloe's closest friends, had clearly, subtly, started dropping out of conversations right before they turned cruel, going quiet at exactly the moments Mateo's black heart appeared, which Mateo said he'd noticed too, and had privately wondered about for weeks, without ever having the nerve to test the theory. That detail rearranged something in my head. It's easy, when you're the one drowning, to assume the whole ocean hates you, that every single person watching is either actively cheering for your death or too monstrous to care. And it is a genuinely different feeling to sit on a bedroom floor and realize that a decent chunk of that ocean is actually just scared, quietly uncomfortable, staying silent for the same exhausted, self-protective reasons Mateo had described about his own 8th grade year, not because they enjoyed it, but because saying something out loud felt more dangerous than staying quiet and hoping it would blow over. That didn't make it okay. I want to be clear that I did not, sitting there, suddenly forgive 3 weeks of soup jokes out of sheer empathetic generosity. But it changed the shape of the problem in my head from an entire grade united against me into something smaller and stranger and, weirdly, more solvable. A loud, cruel minority propped up by a much larger, quieter majority who mostly just wanted permission to stop. I didn't tell my parents about the folder that night either, which in retrospect was probably a mistake. But I did come home in a noticeably better mood than I'd been in for 3 weeks, enough that my mom actually stopped chopping vegetables mid-onion to stare at me and ask who I was and what I'd done with her son. And I told her, honestly, that I'd made a friend, which was true, and felt bigger saying it out loud than I expected. Like naming a thing made it more real. I did eventually tell my parents the whole story properly, though it took almost 2 more weeks, and it happened, in the end, entirely by accident. On a Sunday afternoon when my dad, looking for a stapler for one of his project folders, borrowed my laptop off the kitchen counter without thinking twice about it, the way parents do in houses where borrowing a laptop for 5 seconds has never once been a crisis, and found, sitting open in a background tab I'd forgotten to close, an old browser window still logged into the basement from my own phone's messaging sync, a conversation frozen mid-scroll on one of the uglier threads from back in September. He didn't say anything to me right away. He just closed the laptop very carefully, set it back down exactly where he'd found it, and went and got my mother from the garden, and the two of them sat me down at the kitchen table that evening with an expression I'd never seen on either of their faces before. Not angry, which somehow would have been easier, but a kind of quiet, focused seriousness that made my stomach drop the second I saw it, because I knew immediately, without either of them saying a word, exactly what they'd seen. I told them everything that night, the whole thing, start to finish, the phone number typo, the poll about my bathroom crying schedule, Mateo's folder, the black heart, all of it. And I want to be honest that it was harder to say out loud to them than it had been to say to Mateo at that water fountain. Not because I trusted them less, but because some old, stubborn part of me had spent an entire year quietly convinced that telling them would mean admitting I couldn't handle my own life, that being 15, almost 16, meant you were supposed to be past the age where you ran to your parents with a problem like this. My mother cried at the part about the poll, actual tears, quickly wiped away like she was embarrassed by them. And my father, who processes almost everything through home improvement metaphors, went very quiet for a long moment and then said something I still think about, which was, "You know, when I recaulk a bathroom and find rot underneath the old seal, the worst thing I can do is just caulk over it again and hope nobody notices. You have to actually dig it out first, even when digging it out makes the whole thing look worse for a while before it looks better." And I sat there at that kitchen table, 16 years old, being handed home renovation wisdom as emotional support, and somehow it was exactly the right thing to hear. What surprised me most that night wasn't their reaction to the cruelty, which I'd braced for. It was how quickly the conversation turned, almost entirely, to Mateo. My mother asking question after question. Is he okay? Does his mother know? Is he eating enough? Does he need anything? In the specific, relentless, practical way she processes worry, by immediately looking for something useful to do with it. And by the end of that conversation, she had already mentally drafted a plan to invite Sofia Garcia over for dinner. A plan that, as it turned out, set into motion the entire warm, tangled friendship between our two families that would go on to define so much of the following 2 years. My dad, for his part, asked exactly one more question before declaring the conversation officially over for the night in the specific way he does when he's decided emotional processing time has reached its productive limit, which was whether the school knew any of this. And when I admitted they didn't, not really, not the full scope of it, he said, calmly, but with a firmness I didn't often hear from him, "That's going to change." And it did. Not dramatically, not with lawyers or ultimatums, just a quiet, persistent email exchange between my mother and Ms. Castillo over the following weeks that laid the groundwork, months before I even fully understood it was happening, for exactly the kind of paper trail that would matter enormously once things escalated to the mascot photo and the cafeteria and everything that came after. I want to say, looking back on it now, that this was the actual turning point of the whole story, more than the pep rally, more than the gallery showcase, more than any single dramatic public moment, because it was the point where I stopped trying to carry the entire weight of it alone, where I finally understood something my mother had apparently known my whole life without ever needing to say it directly, that asking for help isn't the failure. The failure is staying quiet long enough that help doesn't get the chance to arrive in time. Over the next month, Mateo and I fell into a rhythm that felt so easy it almost embarrassed me, given how hard I'd worked myself up over just saying hello to him. We started eating lunch together, first at the far end of a mostly empty table near the recycling bins that nobody wanted, which suited us fine, since neither of us had any interest in being seen, and then, gradually, as we got more comfortable, at an actual table with actual other people. Because it turns out, Anya Gupta, once she found out what had actually been happening, had been quietly furious enough to start deliberately sitting with us as a kind of one-woman protest, bringing Marco Santos along with her, who mostly just ate in companionable silence and occasionally offered devastatingly dry one-liners that made Mateo laugh so hard he choked on a chicken nugget once, an event Mateo insists on bringing up regularly to this day. Mateo started teaching me photography, which was the thing he actually loved more than the drawing, it turned out. Sketching was just what he did on paper when he didn't have his mom's old hand-me-down camera with him. A battered little mirrorless thing with a cracked strap that he treated like a family heirloom because, as he explained without any drama at all, it basically was one. It had been his mom's before the divorce, back when she used to take pictures for fun instead of invoices for a catering company at 11 at night. He took me out on a Saturday to shoot the abandoned rail yard 2 streets from his apartment, a place that looked, to my untrained eye, like a place you get tetanus. And through his camera, framed just right, with the low afternoon light hitting the rust at an angle, looked like something out of a magazine. I want to be honest, spectacularly bad at it. My first 20 photos were either badly framed, badly focused, or somehow both. And Mateo, instead of being polite about it the way I expected, just laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Wow, okay, we have a lot of work to do," in a tone so genuinely delighted by my incompetence that I couldn't even be offended. And by the end of that afternoon, he'd taught me enough about light and framing that I took one photo, just one, of a rusted shopping cart half swallowed by weeds that he actually stopped and looked at for a long moment and said, quietly, "Okay, that one's actually good," in a voice that made me feel like I'd won an Olympic medal. In exchange, Since I apparently needed to contribute something to this friendship besides my own emotional wreckage, I helped him with the thing he was worst at, which was talking to teachers. Specifically, the process of applying for a summer arts program at the community college that he'd wanted to apply for 2 years running and chickened out of both times because the application required an in-person interview. And Mateo, it turned out, could talk for an hour straight about aperture settings, but turned into a stammering, monosyllabic wreck the second an authority figure asked him a direct question about himself. We practiced in his kitchen for 2 weeks straight, me playing the world's most annoying mock interviewer, asking him things like, "Why do you want this opportunity?" in an increasingly ridiculous fake serious voice, until he was laughing too hard to be nervous anymore. And by the time the actual interview rolled around, he walked in, he told me later, genuinely calm, because compared to my fake interview voice, the real interviewer seemed downright gentle. He got in. I found out over text during 5th period and had to physically stuff my face into my binder to stop myself from cheering out loud in the middle of a pop quiz, which Mr. Harrison noticed and, mercifully, chose not to comment on beyond one raised eyebrow. Our families met properly around this time, too, in the specific, slightly chaotic way families meet when their kids have decided, independently and without asking permission, that this friendship is now a permanent installation in both households. My mom, upon hearing Mateo's mom worked 2 jobs, immediately and without any subtlety whatsoever, started sending home extra portions of whatever we'd had for dinner, packed in old margarine containers. A gesture Mateo initially tried to politely refuse out of some mixture of pride and embarrassment, until his own mother, Sophia, meeting my mom for the first time at a school open house, took one look at her, recognized an identical species of relentless maternal feeding instinct, and the two of them bonded so instantly and so thoroughly over a shared belief that teenage boys are perpetually one meal away from starvation, that by the following week, they had a standing text thread solely dedicated to trading recipes and complaining, with visible affection, about how little their sons told them about their days. My dad, upon meeting Mateo for the first time, did the thing my dad does with literally every person who enters our house, which is immediately try to enlist them in whatever home improvement project he's currently 3 weekends deep into, and somehow, in a turn of events nobody saw coming, discovered that Mateo, from spending years constructing elaborate sketchbook worlds with actual architectural logic, had a genuinely excellent eye for spatial layout, and the two of them spent an entire Saturday afternoon in our backyard arguing cheerfully about the best angle for a new deck railing, while I sat on the porch steps watching my socially anxious best friend hold his own in a 2-hour debate about load-bearing posts with my extremely stubborn father, and feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as violently, embarrassingly happy. I want to pause here and say something that took me a long time to actually put into words, even to myself, which is that the friendship with Mateo didn't fix the fact that a good-sized chunk of my grade still thought I was a punchline. The soup jokes didn't stop overnight. Someone still occasionally made a slurping noise at me in the hallway well into October, and the basement, as far as either of us could tell from Mateo's continued silent presence in it, kept humming along in the background, occasionally flaring back up with some new joke whenever the soup material got stale. But something had genuinely shifted in how much all of that could actually reach me. The way a house with a good roof doesn't stop the rain from falling, it just stops the rain from being the thing that ends you, and having somewhere warm and dry to go every day. Having someone who'd seen the absolute worst private version of what people said about me and had chosen, repeatedly, deliberately, to sit next to me anyway, turned out to matter more than any single one of my old fantasies about public revenge ever could have. I did occasionally still fantasize about revenge, I'll be honest, usually around 11 at night when the soup jokes replayed themselves uninvited in my head. Elaborate scenarios where I stood up in some dramatic school assembly and read every cruel message aloud into a microphone, while Chloe Peterson wept and begged for mercy in front of the entire student body. And every single time I pictured it, I noticed, tellingly, that Mateo was never in the fantasy at all, because the fantasy was never actually about anything getting better. It was just about hurting someone back exactly as much as I'd been hurt, which is a different goal entirely. And increasingly, the longer I spent actually eating lunch with real, specific, warm people, instead of imaginary crowds gasping at my imaginary triumph, the less that fantasy felt like something I even wanted anymore. What I wanted, it turned out, watching Mateo laugh at his own bad photography instructor jokes, watching him talk architecture with my dad, watching him walk a little taller in the hallway now that someone finally knew, was just for it to stop. Not spectacularly, not with anyone kneeling and begging. Just stop, quietly, the way a bad noise finally does when you find the source and switch it off. I didn't know yet how far that was from what was actually coming, because Chloe Peterson, it turned out, was nowhere near done. And the thing about a queen who's just discovered her kingdom is quietly rotting from the inside is that she rarely responds to that discovery with grace. I should say, before I get into what Chloe did next, that I did not understand Chloe Peterson at all for most of that year, and it wasn't until much later, through a combination of Mateo's quiet observations and one deeply uncomfortable conversation I'll get to eventually, that I understood her even a little. And understanding her didn't excuse anything, but it did make the whole thing feel less like a horror movie and more like a genuinely sad, entirely avoidable chain reaction. Chloe's older sister, Emily Peterson, had graduated from Crestview 4 years earlier, having been, by every account I ever heard, something close to a legend. Homecoming queen, valedictorian, captain of the debate team, the kind of student teachers still mentioned wistfully years later when they wanted to make a point about potential. And Chloe had spent her entire life walking hallways lined with framed photos of her sister's face on the wall outside the main office. A literal, physical monument to a bar she'd been quietly expected to clear since kindergarten. Her mother, from the little Mateo had picked up over the years from mutual acquaintances, was not a cruel woman exactly, but she was a relentless one. The kind of parent who asks about test scores before she asks about your day. And somewhere along the way, Chloe had apparently absorbed the lesson that being loved and being impressive were the same transaction, and that the fastest, most reliable way to be impressive in a school that couldn't care less about your debate trophies was to be the undisputed center of its social gravity, the person whose opinion of you mattered more than any teacher's, more than any grade, the person everyone quietly checked with before considering how to feel about anything. Owen Hayes, for his part, had a much less interesting but no less explanatory story, which was that he had been in love with Chloe since approximately the 7th grade, in the specific, hopeless, devoted way that turns a person into a golden retriever with a grudge, willing to do absolutely anything, including being cruel to a total stranger over a chemistry answer, if it meant a flicker of approval from the one person whose approval he'd decided years ago was the only currency worth collecting. Mateo, filling in gaps I didn't have from his own 2 years of quiet, careful observation, told me once that the strangest part of watching Chloe and Owen operate from the inside of the basement was how rarely either of them actually seemed to enjoy any of it in the moment, the jokes landing more like transactions than entertainment. Screenshots and reactions traded back and forth with the flat, compulsive rhythm of people checking a stock price rather than people having fun. And it was only looking back, once he understood their histories a little better through May, that the pattern made any real sense to him at all. 2 teenagers who had each, independently, decided that being essential to somebody else's approval was safer than simply being liked for no particular reason, and who had built, without either of them ever naming it out loud, an entire miserable economy around proving that essentialness to each other week after week. None of this made the soup video funny. None of it made the polls about my bathroom crying schedule anything other than genuinely rotten. But it did mean that when Chloe found out, sometime in mid-October, through channels I never fully pinned down, that Mateo Garcia had apparently been spotted eating lunch with the kids she'd spent 2 months making fun of, and that the 2 of them had somehow become, in the words of one particularly unhelpful basement message Mateo showed me later, weirdly tight now, her reaction wasn't curiosity or concern. It was the specific, cornered fury of someone who experiences any crack in her own control as an existential threat. Because if I could survive, if the target could just quietly build himself a life outside her jurisdiction and come out the other side fine, then the entire premise of her power, the idea that her disapproval was a sentence with no appeal, simply stopped being true. Spirit Week landed in early November that year, the annual gauntlet of themed dress-up days and pep rallies that Crestview throws every fall with a level of institutional enthusiasm wildly disproportionate to how much anyone actually enjoys wearing their pajamas to school on a Tuesday. And the centerpiece, as always, was the Friday pep rally, a full school assembly in the gym featuring exactly one segment that every student both dreaded and secretly loved. A bit called Hot Seat, where the junior class student council, this year run by none other than Chloe Peterson as junior class social chair, a title she had campaigned for the previous spring with the single-minded intensity most people reserve for actual political office, collected anonymous submitted index cards with playful roasts about specific students, and had the MC read a curated selection of them out loud to the whole gym. Ostensibly in good fun, historically a genuinely fun tradition when it stayed in the lane of gentle, affectionate ribbing about somebody's terrible parking or somebody's obsession with a specific snack, and, in practice, entirely dependent on who happened to be running the card selection that particular year. Mateo found out what Chloe was planning 3 days before the rally, through the exact mechanism he'd spent a year building for precisely this purpose. Somebody in the basement, giddy with the kind of confidence that comes from believing yourself untouchable, had posted a photo of a stack of index cards fanned out on a desk, at least 6 of them, Mateo counted later from the screenshot, all clearly about me, in different handwriting meant to disguise the fact that they'd all been written by the same small circle of people, with a caption that said something like, "Can't wait for Friday, he's not going to know what hit him," and a string of laughing emojis from Owen and 2 other names I recognized vaguely as Chloe's inner circle. Mateo texted me that same night, a message I still have saved which just said, "We need to talk. It's about Friday. Call me now." And when I called, sitting on my bedroom floor with my back against the bed the way I always sat for anything serious, he read me the messages one by one in that same careful, flat voice. And I felt something in my stomach drop that was different from the soup video, different from the polls, a specific kind of dread that comes from knowing exactly when and exactly where the next hit is coming, which sounds like it should be an advantage, and in some ways was, but mostly just meant I had 3 entire days to sit with the anticipation instead of getting blindsided all at once. My first instinct, embarrassingly, was the old fantasy again, dressed up as a plan, some version of standing up in that gym and announcing to 400 people that I had proof, screenshots, dates, names, the whole rotten architecture of the basement laid bare in front of the entire junior class. And for about a day, I genuinely believed that was what I was going to do. Right up until I said the plan out loud to Mateo over lunch and watched his face go carefully neutral in the specific way it went neutral whenever he was trying very hard not to talk me out of something. I asked him what he actually thought, bracing for him to just support whatever I wanted because that's usually what a good friend does. And instead, he put his fork down and said slowly that he believed me, that he thought I deserved to do that if I chose to, he would stand up right next to me and hand out screenshots himself, but that he wanted me to think honestly about what I actually wanted to feel walking out of that gym afterward, because he'd spent a full year of his life inside a chat gathering evidence for exactly this kind of moment. And somewhere in that year, he'd realized that the fantasy of the big reveal always ended at the moment of the reveal itself, freeze-framed on everyone's shocked faces, and never actually continued forward into the next day, the next week, the rest of junior year, sitting in homeroom 3 feet from people you'd just publicly detonated. And he genuinely didn't know, he said, whether that was a movie ending or just a different, louder kind of war. I didn't have an answer for him that day. I went home and lay on my bedroom floor staring at the ceiling for a genuinely embarrassing amount of time, running both versions in my head. The gym full of shocked faces and the quieter, stranger idea slowly forming underneath it. Something I couldn't fully articulate yet except as a feeling, that the thing I actually wanted wasn't for Chloe Peterson to be destroyed in front of an audience. It was for the joke to simply, finally, stop landing. For the room to look at whatever card got read about me and, instead of laughing the way they were supposed to, just feel a little confused about why it was supposed to be funny at all. That's a much harder thing to engineer than a dramatic reveal. It doesn't have a script. It requires, more than anything, an almost unbearable amount of nerve, standing in front of 400 people and choosing, on purpose, to look ridiculous before anyone else gets the chance to make you look that way, and betting your entire social existence on the theory that the fastest way to defuse a bomb somebody built to hurt you is to pick it up yourself, cheerfully, before they ever get to press the button. I decided somewhere around 1 in the morning, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that had slowly, over 3 years, come to resemble a fairly convincing manatee, that I was going to try it. And I texted Mateo just one word: okay. And he texted back immediately, like he'd been lying awake waiting for exactly that word. Tell me the plan. And I said, honestly, I don't have one yet. I just know I'm not doing the microphone speech. And he sent back a single black heart emoji, which, from him, I now understood, was the single highest compliment available. We spent the next 2 days building it in his kitchen after school, surrounded by his mom's invoicing paperwork and an alarming quantity of gas station snacks. Because apparently strategic planning against social humiliation requires the same fuel as a video game marathon. The actual mechanics of hot seat, Mateo explained, having watched it happen to other kids for 2 years with the clinical detachment of someone taking field notes on a predator, worked like this. Cards got submitted anonymously into a box outside the cafeteria all week. The student council pre-screened them for anything that would get a teacher fired on the spot, which left an extremely generous amount of room for anything short of that. And then the MC, a genial, oblivious senior named Finn, who had run Hot Seat for 2 years running purely because he had a good radio voice and no idea he was being used as a delivery mechanism for other people's cruelty, read a selection out loud, usually building to whatever the student council chair, this year Chloe, quietly flagged as the best one, saved for near the end for maximum impact. If I wanted any chance of controlling how my own card landed, Mateo said, I needed 2 things. I needed to know roughly when in the lineup mine would come, which we solved by Mateo simply asking Finn directly, in the most casual voice imaginable, whether Hot Seat still did the thing where the best one goes near the end. A question so mundane, Finn answered it without a single suspicious thought, confirming yes. Always saves the banger for like card 9 or 10, and I needed a way to get my own response into the room immediately after mine got read, before the laugh could fully land and calcify into the room's permanent memory of the moment. That second part took longer to figure out, and it was actually Anya, roped into the planning by that point, along with Marco, who cracked it, pointing out that Hot Seat always ended with Finn asking if anyone wanted to grab the mic and roast back, a tradition nobody ever actually took him up on, because doing so required a level of composure under pressure that most 16-year-olds simply do not have. And Anya's exact words were, nobody ever takes the mic because everybody's too busy dying inside. But you already know it's coming. You'll be the only person in that gym who isn't surprised. The morning of the rally, I want to be honest, I threw up. Just the once, quietly before breakfast, which I did not mention to my mother, who would have kept me home in a heartbeat and possibly called the school district directly, and I spent all of 1st through 4th period in a state of low-grade nausea, so persistent that Mr. Harrison actually asked if I was coming down with something, and I said, truthfully, something like that. Mateo found me outside the gym doors right before we filed in, and he didn't say anything encouraging or motivational, which I appreciated more than I can explain. He just stood next to me in the hallway crush of 400 kids in pajama day pajamas and school color face paint, and handed me, wordlessly, one of his own sketchbook pages folded into a small square, which I opened once I was seated in the bleachers, and it was a drawing, quick and rough compared to his usual careful work, clearly done in the last 20 minutes, of me, standing at a microphone, drawn with this loose, confident line, shoulders back, and underneath it, in his small, careful handwriting, it just said, "You've survived worse rooms than this one." I have kept that piece of paper in my desk drawer for the rest of high school, and I fully intend to keep it for the rest of my life. Hot Seat started the way it always did, Finn bounding out with a wireless mic and a grin, reading gentle, forgettable cards about somebody's terrible free throw form and somebody's 5 different flavors of energy drink in one backpack. The gym doing its warm, easy laugh, the kind that costs nothing and means nothing and is honestly kind of nice when it's actually harmless. Card 6 was about a girl's extremely aggressive devotion to a specific boy band. Card 7 was a genuinely funny one about the marching band director's coffee addiction. And then Finn unfolded card 8, and I felt Mateo go very still beside me, and Anya's hand find my arm without either of us looking at each other, because we all recognized, before Finn even read a word, the exact careful, too clever phrasing of something Chloe had personally polished. Finn read it out loud in his big radio voice. Something about a certain junior who apparently thinks correcting people in chemistry class makes him the main character. Maybe he should try correcting his own tray-carrying technique next. And the gym did laugh. A bigger, sharper laugh than the free throw joke had gotten. 400 people's heads swiveling instinctively to find me in the bleachers, the way a crowd always seems to know exactly where to look. And I felt my face go hot. And for one full second, one genuinely terrifying second, the old fantasy and the new plan collapsed into the same feeling, pure animal panic. And I thought, I can't do this. I'm going to sit here and let it land and go home and never come back. And then I felt Mateo's shoulder press once, briefly, against mine. Not a nudge, just contact. Just a reminder that he was there, and I stood up. I want to describe the walk down those bleachers honestly, because it did not feel triumphant. It felt like walking into an ocean that might be freezing or might be fine, and there was no way to know until you were already in it. 400 faces turning to track me the whole way down, whispers starting, somebody near the front actually gasping like this was the good part of a movie. And Finn, genuinely delighted and utterly unaware of any subtext, saying into the mic, "Oh, we've got to take her, folks. When has that ever happened? Get up here." I took the mic from him with a hand that was, I promise you, shaking so hard I had to grip it with both hands. And I looked out at the gym, at Chloe in the front row of the student council section looking, for the first time since I'd met her, genuinely uncertain about what was about to happen. And I said, into the microphone, in a voice I don't fully recognize as my own even now, "You know what? That's actually fair. My tray-carrying technique needs work. And I don't want to name names, but somebody's foot really came out of nowhere that day. Truly an Olympic-level maneuver. I've been meaning to nominate them for the hurdles team." The gym laughed. Not the sharp laugh from before, a different one. Surprised. Delighted. The specific laugh of a crowd that just watched someone survive a hit they weren't supposed to survive. And I kept going before my nerve could catch up with what my mouth was doing, saying that honestly, if we're doing report cards today, I think the whole soup video deserves at least a B+ for production value. Somebody added a slide whistle within the hour. That's actual dedication. I respect the commitment to the bit even though I was the bit. And by now the laugh had turned into something closer to applause. Kids actually clapping. And I saw, out of the corner of my eye, Owen's face doing something complicated and unhappy in the front row, and Chloe's expression had gone perfectly, carefully blank, in the specific way I now recognized, from months of studying her secondhand through a screenshot folder, as the look of someone recalculating in real time and not liking a single number she was getting. I finished by saying, genuinely, I actually think Hot Seat should bring back the free throw jokes. Those were way funnier. And handed the mic back to Finn, who was grinning so widely I thought his face might actually crack, and said, into it as I walked away, "Folks, that's how you take a hit." And the whole gym, and I mean the whole gym, erupted into the kind of applause that has nothing to do with how funny anything actually was, and everything to do with 400 teenagers collectively, instinctively recognizing that they had just watched something rare and satisfying happen in real time. A joke get picked up by its intended target and turned, cheerfully, deliberately, into something that no longer belonged to the person who threw it. I walked back to my seat on legs that did not feel entirely like my own, and Mateo, when I sat back down next to him, didn't say anything at all. He just looked at me for a second with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something like pride, and reached over and, very quietly, so quietly I almost missed it under the noise of the gym still buzzing, drew a tiny heart on the back of my hand with the pen from his jacket pocket. Not black this time, just blue ballpoint. But I understood exactly what he meant by it, and I didn't wash it off for 2 days. I found out later from Anya, who heard it from Mei Lin, who by that point had drifted so far from Chloe's inner circle that she'd started quietly telling people things. I asked Anya once, much later, what had actually caused that drift, since Mei had always seemed, from the outside, like one of Chloe's closest and most loyal friends. And Anya said she'd asked Mei the exact same question over a different lunch table entirely. And Mei's answer had apparently been the black heart itself, or rather, the moment she'd finally noticed it, the same way I once had. Except Mei hadn't gone looking for a mystery to solve. She'd simply been scrolling back through old messages one bored evening, searching for an unrelated address someone had posted weeks earlier, and stumbled across the same quiet pattern I had. A small gray heart landing again and again under the ugliest sentence in any given thread. And something about seeing that silent, consistent objection sitting there for months, unremarked and unanswered, had apparently needled at her in a way she couldn't quite shake. A small, persistent voice asking her what exactly she was still doing in a room where even the quietest, least powerful person in it seemed to know something was wrong that she herself had been too comfortable to admit. She never worked up the nerve to say anything out loud, not for weeks. But she started quietly, the way people do when their conscience is working on them faster than their courage can keep up, going silent at exactly the moments the jokes turned sharpest, then skipping a few of the worst conversations altogether. Then finally, once the mascot photo crossed whatever line had been slowly forming in her over the entire fall, forwarding the evidence herself without waiting to be asked, less out of loyalty to me or to Mateo, she admitted to Anya, and more out of loyalty to some version of herself she still wanted to be able to recognize in the mirror. I also found out around that same time that the ride home from the rally in Chloe's car had been, in May's words, genuinely unhinged. Chloe white-knuckling the steering wheel the entire way and saying over and over, "Someone told him. There's no way he just improvised that. Someone warned him." Which was, I want to point out for the historical record, a wildly generous overestimate of my own improvisational skills. But Chloe, having spent an entire year believing she controlled every piece of information moving through our grade, could not accept the much simpler and much more embarrassing explanation, which was that I had simply gotten lucky and desperate in exactly the right proportions. She spent the following week, according to May, in a kind of quiet, simmering detective mode of her own, trying to figure out who could possibly have tipped me off, and her suspicion, once it landed on Mateo with a speed that genuinely surprised me when I heard about it. Though in hindsight it made a certain cold sense, because Chloe, unlike most of the school, actually had a memory long enough to reach back to freshman year and Mateo's own 2-month stint as the seller's target. And she was apparently the one person paranoid enough to wonder out loud, at lunch, in front of at least 6 people, whether the quiet kid who'd once been on the receiving end of exactly this treatment might have found some way to get his own back through me. I want to be clear that Chloe had no actual proof of this, none of Mateo's screenshotting or his year of silent black hearts. She had nothing but a hunch and a memory, and crucially, an old buried piece of information that she happened to be sitting on for entirely unrelated reasons, which is the part of this story that I still find hardest to think about even now. Chloe and Mateo, it turned out, had been genuinely close once, years earlier, back in 4th and 5th grade, before Crestview's social hierarchy had calcified into whatever it had become by high school, back when Chloe was just a kid whose older sister hadn't graduated yet, and whose mother's expectations hadn't fully closed in around her. And the two of them had been in the same after-school program together for 2 full years. Closer, Mateo told me much later with a strange, complicated look on his face, than either of them had ever told anyone since. It was Chloe, of all people, that 11-year-old Mateo had cried in front of at that 6th grade sleepover that later got videoed and turned into ammunition, except the sleepover itself had actually been at Chloe's house, and Chloe back then had been the one who hugged him and told her mom to leave him alone about it. And it was a different kid entirely, someone who'd overheard through a thin wall and filmed part of it on an old phone, who'd actually leaked it years later once middle school scattered everyone into new alliances and old loyalties stopped mattering the way they used to. But Chloe knew one specific thing from those years that nobody else at Crestview knew, a detail Mateo had told her in total confidence back when confiding in her felt safe, which was that Mateo, to help his mom with rent after the divorce, had spent the last 2 summers and most weekends working at Mulligan's Mini Golf on Route 9. Not behind the counter, not collecting putters, but inside the giant, sweltering, foam-headed costume of Mulligan the Gopher, the mascot who waved at passing cars from the parking lot entrance and occasionally did a small dance for birthday parties, a job Mateo was quietly, deeply proud of, because he was genuinely good at it. The other kids who worked there said he did the best gopher shuffle they'd ever seen, and also a job he had never once mentioned to anyone at school besides me, because he'd learned, the hard way, exactly what a school full of teenagers can do with a piece of information like that if it falls into the wrong hands. It fell into the wrong hands on a Thursday. I don't know to this day whether Chloe went looking for it deliberately, planning ahead of time to use it if her suspicion about Mateo turned out to be right, or whether it was something closer to opportunism, a memory surfacing at a convenient moment and getting used before she'd fully thought through the consequences. And honestly, by the time I confronted her about it much later, I'm not sure even she could tell the difference anymore between planning cruelty and simply reaching for the first weapon within arm's reach. What I do know is that on that Thursday afternoon, a photo appeared in the basement, and within about 40 minutes had leaked, the way these things always leak, sideways into a wider group chat, and from there onto the public class social media page. A candid photo taken from a car window in the Mulligan's parking lot, clearly zoomed and cropped to frame it as unflatteringly as possible, of Mateo mid-shuffle in the full gopher costume, buck teeth slightly askew, one giant foam paw raised in an awkward wave, and the caption, in Chloe's unmistakable careful phrasing, read something like, "So this is what our resident silent genius does on weekends. Guess we know who really needs the tray-carrying lessons now," and underneath it, the same 40-some kids who'd once laughed at me lit the thread up instantly, a screenshot slideshow of the exact same escalation I'd survived weeks earlier, except this time, aimed at somebody who had spent an entire extra year already surviving this once and had built his entire fragile sense of safety on the specific belief that if he just stayed quiet and useful and invisible enough, it would never happen to him again. I found out because Mateo texted me. Not a call this time, just a single photo of his own phone screen showing the post. No words at all, which, from Mateo, who always found language even in his worst moments, scared me more than anything he could have actually said. I called him 4 times before he picked up, and when he finally did, his voice was so flat and so far away that it took me a second to place it as him at all. And he said, "I should have known. I should have known she'd remember." And then, quieter, "I actually thought that part of my life was safe. I thought that was the one thing nobody could ever use." And I sat there on my bedroom floor with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, feeling a specific, cold, focused fury that I had genuinely never felt on my own behalf. Not once. Not during the soup video, not during the polls, because it turns out there is a very particular kind of anger reserved specifically for watching someone hurt the person who spent a year quietly, uselessly, bravely trying to protect people they'd never even properly spoken to. And it is a much, much larger anger than anything you can generate purely in your own defense. I asked him if he wanted me to do anything, expecting him to say no, the way he always deflected help. And instead, in a voice that had gone somewhere very small, he said, "I don't know if I can walk into that cafeteria tomorrow." And I said, without even fully deciding to say it, "You won't have to walk in alone." And I hung up and immediately called Anya, and then Marco, and then, on an impulse I couldn't fully explain even to myself, I called my mom, because it occurred to me, for the first time in this entire saga, that I was finally facing a problem too big to solve on my own with a spreadsheet and a lucky microphone moment, and that maybe it was time to stop treating every adult in my life as someone who simply couldn't understand, and start treating them like backup. Before any of that, though, Anya and Marco showed up at Mateo's apartment within the hour. Anya carrying, somewhat absurdly, an entire grocery bag of snacks she'd grabbed on the way over because, in her words, crisis logistics without snacks is just chaos. And the 4 of us sat crowded into Mateo's small bedroom, surrounded by his sketches, the folder of screenshots pulled back up on his laptop for the first time in weeks, and worked through, piece by piece, exactly how bad the damage actually was. Mateo sat mostly silent through the first 20 minutes, knees pulled up to his chest on his own bed in a way that made him look younger than 16. And it was Marco, of all people, usually the quietest one in any group conversation, who finally said the thing that seemed to loosen something in him, leaning forward and saying flatly, in his dry, unhurried voice, "For what it's worth, man. I've known you a grand total of 2 months, and I already think the gopher thing is the coolest fact I've ever learned about anyone. So, whatever happens tomorrow, that's not changing." And Mateo, who I don't think had cried once in front of any of us up to that point despite everything, had to turn his face toward the window for a second, blinking hard, before he could say thank you. We didn't come up with the actual plan that night. That came together more slowly over the next 24 hours. But what we did do, sitting on that bedroom floor eating Anya's slightly stale grocery store snacks, was make Mateo a promise, out loud, all three of us in turn, that whatever happened the next day in that cafeteria, whether it went well or went badly or went nowhere at all, he was not walking into that room by himself, not this time, not ever again if we had anything to say about it. And I remember Mateo looking around at the three of us crammed into his small bedroom, an expression on his face that I'd never quite seen before, somewhere between disbelief and the specific, cautious hope of someone who has spent a very long time preparing for people to eventually leave and is only just beginning to let himself believe that maybe, this time, they actually won't. It was nearly 11 when Anya and Marco finally left, and I stayed another 20 minutes, mostly in silence, sitting next to Mateo on his bed while Sophia, home briefly between her two jobs, put her head in once to ask, quietly, if everyone was okay, get a general nod in response, and then retreated to the kitchen to, we found out later, quietly cry into a dish towel for exactly the reasons you'd expect a mother to cry after learning her son's private summer job had just been turned into a weapon by people he used to trust. Before I left that night, Mateo said something I've held on to ever since, sitting there in the dark with just his desk lamp on, casting long shadows across all those sketchbook pages taped to the walls. He said, "You know, a year ago, if this exact thing had happened, the photo, the leak, all of it, I think I would have just stopped coming to school for a while, told my mom I was sick, waited for it to blow over the way I waited out everything back then." And I asked him, quietly, "What's different now?" And he thought about it for a long moment, tracing the edge of his laptop with one finger, and said, "I think it's that back then I genuinely believed I was the only person who'd ever noticed something like this happening, so there wasn't any point saying anything. Nobody was going to see it who mattered. And now I know that's not true anymore. And knowing that changes what silence actually costs, because staying quiet used to feel like safety, and now it just feels like waiting." And I didn't have anything to add to that, so I just sat with him a while longer in that quiet, lamp-lit room before heading home myself, into a house where, as it turned out, my own long-overdue reckoning with my parents was still one Sunday and one forgotten laptop tab away from arriving. My mom listened to the whole update that night at the kitchen table without interrupting once, which is genuinely unusual for her, and when I finally finished catching her up on everything that had happened since that Sunday afternoon with the laptop, the pep rally, the gopher shuffle, and now this new photo spreading through the cafeteria on top of everything she already knew, she sat quietly for a moment and then said the thing that ended up mattering most over the following weeks, which was, "You cannot fix a year of this by yourself in one lunch period, and you shouldn't have to. But you can absolutely decide what kind of person you're going to be walking into that cafeteria tomorrow, and that part is entirely yours." She called the school first thing the next morning, before I even left for the bus, not to demand anyone's expulsion, just to give Ms. Castillo a heads up that something had happened over the weekend involving a photo and a group chat, in case it needed looking into, which felt at the time like a small, almost disappointingly modest gesture, but which turned out to matter enormously later, because it meant that when things finally did land on Ms. Castillo's desk for real, there was already a paper trail showing exactly when concerns had first been raised. Mateo texted me at 7 that morning, one line, "I don't think I can do this." And I texted back, "You're not doing it alone. Meet me at the doors," and stood outside the school entrance for 20 straight minutes in the cold, ignoring 3 separate friends asking why I looked like I was waiting for a bus that wasn't coming, until I saw him walking up the front path, shoulders pulled in tight around his ears the way they used to be back before any of this started, the exact posture of somebody trying to take up as little space in the world as physically possible. And I fell into step beside him without a word. And Anya and Marco, who I'd texted the night before, materialized out of the crowd on either side of us like they'd been waiting there the whole morning, which, it turned out, they had. We walked into that building 4 across, which is not a formation 4 introverted kids typically choose voluntarily, but which felt, that specific morning, like the only formation that made any sense at all. The cafeteria, when we reached it at lunch, had the specific electric hum of a room that already knows something is about to happen. Kids clustered in tighter knots than usual, phones angled slightly toward the door in that unmistakable way phones angle themselves when their owners are hoping to catch something worth posting. And I felt Mateo's whole body tense beside me the second we crossed the threshold. And somebody, predictably from a table near the vending machines, did a small, mocking wave, the kind of exaggerated foam paw wiggle that needed no caption at all. And a ripple of laughter went through that corner of the room. And I felt something in me go very calm and very clear, the way I imagine it feels right before you jump off something high, when the fear briefly stops being fear and just becomes momentum. I didn't walk to our usual table. I walked instead straight toward the center of the cafeteria, toward the exact spot where the most people could see me, and I said loudly in a voice that carried a lot further than I expected it to, hang on, everybody hold up a second, actually." And the room, to my genuine surprise, actually quieted. Partly out of curiosity, and partly, I think, because after Hot Seat 2 weeks earlier, a decent chunk of the school had apparently started paying attention to me the way you pay attention to a kid who has, against all odds, developed a habit of doing something unexpected in a crowded room. I said, "Does anyone else know that Mulligan's Mini Golf has been doing free rounds for birthday parties for like 15 years, and it's basically the best gopher costume in the entire state?" And there was a confused beat of silence, exactly the beat I was hoping for. And then I said, "Because I went there for my cousin's birthday last spring, and the gopher did this insane shuffle, like genuinely insane. Best mascot performance I've ever personally witnessed, and I've been to a hockey game." And I turned, deliberately, to Mateo, whose face had gone through about 4 different expressions in the space of 3 seconds. Confusion, dawning horror, dawning something else entirely, and I said, "That was you, wasn't it?" And he just stared at me. And I said, "Come on, do the shuffle. Everybody needs to see this. I've been talking about it for a week and nobody believes me." There was a genuinely long, terrifying pause where I thought, with real, cold panic, that I had badly miscalculated, that I had just made everything catastrophically worse by dragging Mateo further into the spotlight instead of out of it. And then Marco, bless him forever, called out from beside me in his flat, dry voice, "Do it, man. I've literally never seen you dance and I need this information." And Anya added, "We support you regardless, but I am begging for content." And somebody near the vending machines, one of the kids who'd done the mocking wave 30 seconds earlier, actually laughed. A real laugh this time, not a cruel one, and said, "Wait, is this real? Show us." And Mateo, after one more beat of pure, suspended terror, did the single bravest thing I have ever watched a person do in a school cafeteria, which was straighten up, plant his feet, and do it. The actual gopher shuffle. Arms up, hips swaying, this ridiculous, joyful, committed little dance that he had clearly performed hundreds of times inside a sweltering foam costume for screaming 8-year-olds and had never once imagined performing for an entire cafeteria of his own classmates. And the room, I swear to you, lost its collective mind. In the best possible way, kids actually standing up on benches to see better, someone starting to clap along, a genuine, delighted roar of laughter and applause that had absolutely nothing to do with mockery and everything to do with 400 teenagers watching the quietest kid in school reveal, on purpose, in front of all of them, that he contained something none of them had ever guessed at. Something joyful and strange and entirely his own. Mateo finished the routine with an actual bow, breathing hard, red in the face, and looked directly at me across the cafeteria with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Somewhere between disbelief and pure, unguarded gratitude, and mouthed silently, across all that noise, "You're insane." And I mouthed back, "Takes one to know one." And by the end of that lunch period, I found out later, at least 3 separate group chats, actual friendly ones, not basement adjacent at all, had already started calling Mateo the Gopher King, affectionately, as a compliment, a title he wore, once the shock wore off, with a quiet, disbelieving pride that followed him around for the rest of the year. It did not, I want to be clear, immediately dissolve the basement, and it did not immediately transform Chloe Peterson into a warm and reformed person. Real life does not hand out endings that clean. And there were still a few scattered kids near the back of the room that day who didn't laugh at all, who watched the whole thing with the flat, calculating expression of people whose entire plan had just publicly failed to detonate. But something had shifted, something structural, in the specific currency Chloe had spent her entire junior year building. Because a cafeteria that had just spontaneously, joyfully applauded the exact thing she'd tried to use as a weapon was a cafeteria that no longer fully belonged to her. And everyone in that room, including her, could feel it. What happened next, I want to say clearly, was not something Mateo or I planned, engineered, or even particularly wanted. And I think that matters. Because if I'd sat down that week and tried to script the perfect downfall for Chloe Peterson, I couldn't have written anything half as fitting, or half as accidental, as what actually occurred, which was, at its core, an extremely ordinary act of panic by an extremely ordinary boy who had spent his whole life mistaking devotion for love. Owen, according to May, who by that point had essentially become our unofficial embassy inside enemy territory, spent the rest of that Thursday afternoon in a state of genuine crisis, watching the Gopher Shuffle video get reposted, with affection, across half the junior class's public social pages. Watching the Mulligans photo he and Chloe had so gleefully leaked backfire into a viral moment of unearned adoration for the exact person it was supposed to humiliate. And watching Chloe herself go quiet and pale and furious in a way he had apparently never seen before and never wanted to see again. What Owen did, in his infinite well-meaning idiocy, was try to fix it the only way he knew how, which was to draft a message in the basement rallying the troops for a second wave, something meaner, something that couldn't be turned around and applauded, a membership that specifically referenced screenshots of Mateo's old freshman year sleepover video. The original wound Chloe had apparently confided in nobody but Owen about, dredging it back up with a caption that I still, honestly, can't bring myself to fully repeat. And in his haste, his phone buzzing with 3 other group chats open at once, his thumb landing on the wrong contact thread in the exact way mine had once accidentally landed me inside the basement to begin with, some cosmic sense of irony apparently unwilling to let this story end any other way, Owen sent that entire message, cruel caption, old screenshots and all, not into the basement, but directly into the public junior class group chat. The one with all 211 of us in it, teachers occasionally lurking included. The one Mateo and I and basically everyone else actually used for real. Boring, everyday things like asking what pages the homework was on. It sat there, visible to literally everyone, for 9 full minutes before Owen noticed and deleted it, which, in the modern era, is roughly 8 minutes and 59 seconds longer than it takes for something like that to be screenshotted by no fewer than 11 separate people, several of whom, including, in a final twist I still find almost funny, Mei Lin herself, forwarded it directly to Ms. Castillo's school email within the hour, along with a short note explaining that this had been going on, in various forms, for over a year. Everything moved relatively fast after that, though nothing about it looked like the gym microphone revenge fantasy I used to run through my head at 11 at night. There was no assembly, no dramatic unveiling, no crowd gasping in unison. There was instead a series of quiet, procedural, deeply unglamorous meetings. Ms. Castillo pulling Mateo and me in separately first, gently, mostly just to ask if we were okay and to confirm the basic timeline she already had a rough sketch of from my mom's call days earlier. And then, once she had that timeline, pulling in Chloe and Owen and 3 other names from the chat, along with their parents, for meetings that none of us were in the room for. Though May, who ended up being interviewed too, told us afterward that Chloe had cried in the front office, not performatively, not for effect, but the specific, ugly, cornered crying of someone who has just watched the exact identity she spent years building come apart in front of the one adult whose good opinion of her she'd apparently still, somewhere underneath it all, desperately wanted to keep. Owen got a 2-day suspension and, more devastatingly to him from what I heard, a furious, humiliated phone call from his own father that reportedly ended with his car privileges revoked for the rest of the semester. Chloe's consequences were more complicated, since student council chairs answer to different rules than ordinary students, and in the end, she lost the position entirely. A formal letter going home to her parents, mandatory sessions with Ms. Castillo every other week for the rest of the year, and, in the specific bureaucratic irony that only a school administration could produce, an assigned 20 hours of supervised community service, helping run activities for the middle school's after-school program. The exact kind of program it occurred to me with a strange jolt when I heard about it, that she and Mateo had once been close inside of, a decade earlier, before any of this had happened to either of them. I did eventually have that conversation with Chloe I mentioned earlier, the uncomfortable one, though it didn't come until nearly 2 months later, in February, in the hallway outside the counselor's office, where I happened to be dropping off a form for my mom, and she happened to be leaving one of her mandatory sessions. And instead of just walking past each other, which is what we'd both been doing successfully for weeks, she stopped and said, in a voice with none of its old certainty left in it, "Can I say something?" And I said, "Sure," bracing for an apology I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. What she actually said surprised me. She said she wasn't going to pretend any of it had been okay, or that she deserved for me to forgive her, but she wanted me to know that she remembered, actually remembered, sitting next to 11-year-old Mateo at her own kitchen table, telling her mom to leave him alone, and that some nights that year, she genuinely couldn't understand how she'd become the kind of person capable of using that same year against him. And she didn't have an excuse for it, she said, just an explanation, which was that somewhere around freshman year, she'd decided that being liked and being powerful were the same thing. And once you believe that, she said quietly, staring at the floor tile instead of at me, everyone eventually starts looking like either a threat or a tool. And it takes something breaking, really breaking in front of everyone, to even notice you've stopped being able to tell the difference. I didn't tell her it was fine. It wasn't fine, and I don't think either of us needed me to pretend otherwise. But I did tell her because it felt true, and because Mateo, when I told him about the conversation later that night, agreed it was the right thing to have said. That I hoped the 20 hours with the middle schoolers turned out to be good for her, genuinely. And she looked up at that, surprised, like she'd been braced for something harsher, and said quietly, "Thank you." And that was, as far as I know, the last real conversation either of us ever had with her, though Mateo mentioned once, near the end of the school year, that he'd heard from one of the middle schoolers in that after-school program that the new student council chair helping run craft time was, against every prediction either of us would have made in November, actually really good at it, patient, funny, good with the shy kids especially, and neither of us knew quite what to do with that information except to file it away as proof that people, even the ones who hurt you badly, are rarely just the worst thing they ever did, even when the worst thing they ever did was genuinely, thoroughly bad. Mei Lin started sitting with us properly sometime in December, tentatively at first, the way you approach a group of people you're not sure will actually want you there, and I remember her sliding her tray onto the far end of our table one Tuesday and saying, half joking, half not, "Is it okay if I sit here? I promise I'm not secretly still reporting back to anyone." And Mateo, without even looking up from his sketchbook, said, "We know, you forwarded the thing to Ms. Castillo. You're basically knighted at this point." And May laughed so hard, this real, surprised, relieved laugh, that Marco handed her half his fries without being asked, which at our table is roughly the equivalent of a formal induction ceremony. She turned out to be, once she wasn't spending all her energy managing Chloe's moods, extremely funny in a dry, understated way that paired perfectly with Marco's, the two of them developing an ongoing bit within about 2 weeks that involved narrating the cafeteria like a nature documentary. And it occurred to me, watching our lunch tables slowly grow from 2 anxious kids at the far end near the recycling bins into 5, then 6, once Marco's cousin Alex started tagging along, that this was maybe the actual, unglamorous shape of getting your life back after something like the basement. Not one triumphant gym moment, though that had certainly helped, but a slow, accumulating, almost boring normalcy. More people, more inside jokes, more Tuesdays that were just fine, which turns out to be its own kind of miracle when you've spent a year afraid of what every single day might bring. Mateo's summer arts program acceptance came with a requirement I hadn't fully appreciated when he first told me about it back in October. A spring showcase where accepted students submitted a small portfolio to be displayed, alongside current program participants, at an actual gallery downtown, the Halloran Community Arts Center. A real gallery, with real white walls, and real little printed placards under each piece. And Mateo spent basically every free hour between February and April agonizing over which 6 photographs to submit, dragging me back out to the rail yard twice more, once in the last snow of the season, and once in the first real warmth of spring. chasing some specific quality of light he kept describing in terms I didn't fully understand, but had learned by that point to trust completely. He asked me in March, in a voice that tried very hard to sound casual and did not remotely succeed, whether I'd want to be in one of the photographs, since he'd been wanting to do a portrait series, and every single person he'd tried shooting so far looked, in his exact words, like a hostage negotiation photo. And I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, partly out of loyalty and partly, I'll admit, out of genuine curiosity about what it would feel like to be looked at that carefully by someone who'd spent an entire year training himself to notice everything. We shot it on a Saturday in April, on the roof access landing outside his apartment building, the one spot Sophia had permission to let him use, with the afternoon light coming in low and gold across the water towers of the neighborhood behind me. And Mateo spent almost 40 minutes just adjusting where I stood. Tiny half-inch corrections, turn your shoulder, no, half that much, look past the camera, not at it. Until something clicked for him, and he went very quiet and just started shooting. Fast, sure, completely absorbed. And afterward, scrolling through the results on the little camera screen, he stopped on one, just one, and turned the screen toward me without a word. I still don't have a great way to describe what it felt like to see myself through Mateo's eyes for the first time. Properly, on purpose, not caught mid-fall with a soup tray, not frozen in some humiliating screenshot, but standing on a rooftop in gold light looking somehow like exactly the kind of person worth photographing. And I didn't say anything for a second because my throat had gone tight in a way I hadn't expected, and Mateo, watching my face, said quietly, "That's the one. That's going in the show, is that okay?" And I said, "Yeah, obviously." And then, because I needed to make a joke or I was going to embarrass myself further, added, "Just don't put my old soup tray video on the placard as artist's statement." And he laughed so hard he almost dropped the camera. The showcase happened on a Friday night in late April, and I want to describe the room because I think about it a lot even now. Folding chairs set up along one wall for parents, little cups of lemonade on a table that nobody quite trusted enough to actually drink, 6 framed photographs from each accepted student, hung with careful, even spacing, and Mateo's section, when we finally found it after a nervous 10 minutes of searching, held the rooftop portrait dead center, my own face looking back at me from a real frame on a real gallery wall, with a small white placard underneath that just said, in Mateo's own careful handwriting since the program lets students write their own captions, "Leo, Rooftop, April, for the one who noticed first." I read that caption maybe 6 times standing there, and when I turned to say something to Mateo about it, I found him watching my reaction instead of the photograph, looking nervous in a way I hadn't seen since the water fountain conversation back in September. And I didn't trust myself to say anything clever, so I just said, "This is the best thing anyone has ever made about me, including that time my aunt knitted me a sweater with my face on it, which is a real low bar, but still." And Mateo, relief written all over him, said, "I was worried it was too much." And I said, "It's not too much, it's exactly enough." And I meant it more than almost anything I'd said all year. Both our families came that night, my parents and Lily crowding in next to Sofia Garcia, who had taken a rare night off from both jobs to be there and spent the entire evening in front of that rooftop photograph with an expression that made my own mom quietly pull a tissue out of her purse and hand it over without either of them saying a word. 2 mothers who had spent an entire year worrying separately about their separately struggling sons, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of proof that somewhere in the mess of it, something good and real and permanent had gotten made. My dad, naturally, spent a solid 15 minutes interrogating Mateo about the technical settings on 3 different photographs, with the intensity he usually reserves for deck railings. And Mateo, to his enormous credit, answered every single question in complete, animated detail, clearly delighted to have found one more adult willing to engage with the actual mechanics of the thing he loved, instead of just saying, "It's nice, honey," and moving on. It was on the drive home from that showcase, actually, squeezed into the back seat between Lily and a box of leftover lemonade cups my mom had insisted on taking home so they wouldn't go to waste, that I first noticed something happening at my own school that I hadn't been paying enough attention to. Because Lily, unprompted, staring out the window, said, "There's this kid in my grade, Oscar. Everybody's kind of started being mean to him online." And I felt something cold and immediately familiar drop through my stomach, and I said, Mean how? And Lily, 12 and matter-of-fact in the way only 12-year-olds can manage about genuinely alarming things, said, "There's a group chat. I'm not in it, but Maya told me about it. They made fun of him for crying at recess." And I sat there in that back seat feeling the entire previous year rearrange itself into a shape I recognized instantly. A shape with a name and a location and, crucially, unlike a year earlier, an older brother who now knew exactly, precisely, in granular detail, what needed to happen next. I didn't wait a week to figure out a clever plan this time. I called Ms. Castillo's counterpart at the middle school myself, with my mom's help, the very next Monday, not with proof, not with screenshots, just with a name and a warning and a request that somebody keep an eye on things because I had learned, the hard way, over an entire year, that the single biggest advantage the basement had ever had over any of us was time. The slow, unsupervised accumulation of cruelty that nobody with any power even knew to look for until it had already metastasized into something enormous. I also, that same week, sat Lily down and told her for the first time the entire story. The soup video, the chat, Mateo's black heart, all of it. Things I'd kept from her for a full year out of some misguided instinct to protect her from my own bad year. And she listened with an intensity I hadn't expected from a kid who normally couldn't sit still through a full sitcom episode. And at the end, she said, "So what do I do about Oscar?" And I told her the only real answer I had, which was, "You don't have to be dramatic about it. You don't have to fix the whole thing yourself. You just have to be the one person who doesn't pretend it isn't happening. And if you can, sit with him at lunch sometimes. Because you have no idea how much just one person sitting down next to you can actually do." Lily took that advice more seriously than I expected a 12-year-old to take anything, and by the end of that month, she'd apparently become something like Oscar's unofficial lunch table ally, a development I only found out about because Oscar's mother personally called our house one evening just to thank my mother, in a voice thick with relief, for raising, in her words, the kind of daughter who noticed, a phrase that made my own mother cry for the second time that spring, and made me sit on the stairs afterward thinking, with a strange, quiet pride that had nothing to do with soup videos or gym microphones at all, that maybe this was the actual ending worth having. Not Chloe Peterson humbled in a hallway, not some grand reckoning, just the slow, ordinary spread of one small, learned habit, noticing, sitting down, saying something, passed from Mateo to me to my own 12-year-old sister, quietly rearranging the furniture of an entire school, one lunch table at a time. I want to tell you before I get to the end of this, about the one time in all of this that I got it wrong, badly wrong, with Mateo himself. Because I think it would be dishonest to make this sound like a friendship that sailed through 2 years without a single real crack in it. And because the crack, when it happened, taught me something about the whole black heart philosophy that I don't think I would have understood any other way. It happened in May of junior year, a few weeks after the gopher shuffle, once the immediate crisis had passed and I'd started for the first time in my entire Crestview career, experiencing something that felt uncomfortably close to popularity. Kids I'd never spoken to stopping me in the hallway to say that hot seat comeback was actually insane. An invitation, genuinely surprising, to a small gathering at Alex's older cousin's house that a slightly wider, slightly cooler circle of juniors had started throwing on weekends. And I said yes before really thinking it through, partly out of simple curiosity about a world I'd never had access to before, and partly, if I'm honest with myself now in a way I wasn't able to be at the time, out of a small, ugly, very human hunger to finally feel like I belonged somewhere without an asterisk attached to it. Mateo didn't come. He wasn't invited, technically, and even if he had been, I don't think he would have wanted to. Crowds like that were never his environment, and I told myself, walking into that house that Friday night, that this was completely fine, that having one more thing that was just mine didn't take anything away from what he and I had. What actually happened at that party is embarrassingly small in the retelling, which somehow makes it worse rather than better. Somebody, midway through the evening, asked me, half as a joke, whether the whole gopher thing had actually been real or some kind of setup, and I, 3 sodas deep into feeling more interesting than I'd ever felt in my life, wanting badly to be the kind of person who had a great story to tell at a party like this, told it. The whole thing, mulligans, the costume, the summer job, all of it, laughing along with the room as I did it, enjoying, in a way I still feel sick thinking about, being the person who got to hold the good story instead of the person the story happened to for once. It wasn't cruel, not the way Chloe's caption had been cruel. There was no mockery in it the way I told it. If anything, I told it like I was proud of him. And that's exactly the thing I didn't understand yet. That the problem was never really the tone. The problem was that it wasn't mine to tell it all. That Mateo had shared that detail with exactly one person at that school. Me. Specifically because he trusted that room. That trust. That specific silence. And I had just spent it, casually, for the price of feeling interesting for 20 minutes at a party he wasn't even at. Somebody at that gathering, inevitably, mentioned it to somebody else on Monday. And by Tuesday, it carried its way, second-hand and slightly warped in the retelling, back to Mateo himself. From a kid in his fourth period who asked him, with zero malice but also zero awareness, whether he was still doing the gopher thing this summer, since apparently everyone at that party thought it was awesome. Mateo didn't say anything to me that whole day. I noticed, the way you notice weather changing before you can name why, that he was quieter than usual at lunch, that he answered things in shorter sentences, that he left 5 minutes before the bell instead of walking out with the rest of us. And it took me until that evening, a single text from him that just said, "Can we talk?" for the full weight of what I'd done to actually land on me. We talked on the phone that night, and I want to be honest that it was one of the more uncomfortable conversations of my entire life. Not because Mateo yelled, he never once raised his voice, but because of how quiet and how measured he stayed the entire time, which somehow made it worse than yelling would have. He said, "I told you that because I trusted you specifically, not because I was ready for it to be party conversation." And I said, "I know, I'm sorry. It wasn't like that. I wasn't making fun of you." And he said, "That's not actually the part that matters, whether you were making fun of me or not. The part that matters is that you decided, on your own, without asking me, that my own history was yours to hand out because it made you feel good in the moment. And that's exactly the thing the basement did to both of us, just smaller and gentler, and from somebody I actually trusted, which honestly makes it land in a stranger place than if a stranger had done it." That sentence, comparing what I'd done, even gently, even without cruelty, to the exact machine we'd spent all year fighting together, hit me harder than almost anything else in this entire story. Because it was true, and because I hadn't seen it coming from that angle at all, having spent so long thinking of myself as the person who'd learned the lesson, not the person still capable of relearning it the hard way at somebody else's expense. I apologized properly the next day, in person, at his locker, not the quick hallway kind of sorry you toss off to smooth over an awkward moment, but the kind where I actually said out loud, specifically, what I'd done wrong. That I'd taken something private and used it to make myself look interesting. That it didn't matter that I hadn't meant it cruelly. That meaning well doesn't automatically undo the actual effect of a thing. And that I understood, now, really understood, why it mattered so much to him that information about people gets to stay theirs unless they choose to hand it over themselves. Mateo listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "Thank you for actually naming it instead of just saying, 'Sorry, you're mad.'" And then, after another pause, in a slightly lighter voice, though I could tell it still cost him something to get there, he said, "For the record, I am extremely aware of how much worse this could have gone with basically anyone else at this school." And I said, "I know, and I promise it's not going to happen again." And it didn't. Not because I never made another mistake with him over the following years. Friendships this close over this many years accumulate plenty of small missteps. But because that specific one taught me something I don't think I could have learned any other way, which is that the whole black heart philosophy, the whole idea of witnessing something and refusing to let it slide, has to start at home, in your own mouth, in the small everyday choices about whose stories are yours to tell and whose aren't, long before it ever gets to apply to a group chat or a gym microphone or a hallway full of strangers. The last few weeks of junior year passed in that strange, syrupy way that the end of a school year always does. Half of everyone's brain already checked out into summer, while the other half scrambled through finals. And the basement, as far as any of us could tell, simply stopped. Not with the dramatic finality of a shutdown announcement, but the way a fire just quietly goes out once nobody's left to keep feeding it. 3 of its remaining members having graduated with Chloe's older circle of friends, 2 more having drifted off into their own smaller, quieter group chats after the fallout, and Owen, once his suspension ended, reappearing in the hallways noticeably diminished. Not cruel anymore so much as just adrift. A boy who had spent years organizing his entire personality around being useful to Chloe Peterson, and now had to figure out, for what looked like the first time in his life, who he was when nobody was watching to be impressed. I didn't become friends with Owen. I want to be honest that not every thread in this story got tied into a neat bow, and Owen Hayes remained, for the rest of high school, someone I was simply polite to in hallways, nothing more, which felt like the correct, honest ending for that particular relationship rather than some forced redemption arc neither of us had actually earned. Mateo left for his 6-week summer arts program in June, 3 states away at a small college campus that ran the residential intensive, and I want to admit that the week before he left, I felt a specific, embarrassing dread creeping in that I hadn't expected. Some old, anxious part of my brain quietly convinced that 6 weeks of distance was exactly the kind of gap where a friendship this new and this important could simply evaporate. That he'd come back having found cooler, more interesting photography friends who didn't carry the specific baggage of an entire humiliating school year between them. I did not say any of this out loud because it felt genuinely pathetic to admit. But Mateo, on the drive to the bus station with both our moms trailing behind us carrying his suitcase and a truly alarming number of protein bars Sophia had packed as though he were embarking on an Arctic expedition rather than a 6-week arts program with a full meal plan, turned to me at the platform and said, apropos of nothing, out of the blue, in that careful, direct way he had of saying the important things without any wind-up at all, "You know I'm going to text you every single day, right? This isn't a goodbye." And I said, trying to sound casual and almost certainly failing, I wasn't worried about that. And Mateo, unconvinced, said, "You've had the same face on all week that you had the day before hot seat." And I laughed, because he was right. And because somehow him noticing that, calling it out so plainly, made the actual fear underneath it shrink down to a manageable size. He did text every single day, sometimes just a photo with no caption, a dining hall tray that looked genuinely better than anything Crestview served, a sunset over an unfamiliar quad, once, memorably, a photo of an actual live gopher he'd spotted on the campus lawn with the caption, "Professional Respect," sometimes long, rambling paragraphs about a professor who'd apparently changed how he thought about composition entirely. And I texted back just as often, mostly complaints about my own summer job restocking shelves at the hardware store my dad had gotten me into, interspersed with photos of increasingly elaborate deck-related disasters as my father embarked on yet another project. And somewhere in the middle of that 6 weeks, without either of us naming it directly, the small, anxious voice in my head that had been so sure distance would break something simply went quiet. Because it turns out actual friendship, the real kind, the kind built on an entire year of showing up, travels just fine through a phone screen. It doesn't need the same room to survive. It just needs the 2 people in it to keep choosing to show up anyway. He came back in late July, tanned and taller somehow, though I'm fairly sure that was just posture, walking differently than he had in September, and the first thing he did getting off that bus, before even hugging his mother, was pull an actual physical print out of his bag, carefully protected between 2 pieces of cardboard, and hand it to me without a word. A photograph he said he'd taken the very first week of the program, during a mandatory personal project assignment where everyone had to shoot something from home, something that mattered. And it was, when I finally got the cardboard open, a shot of the 2 of us from the gallery showcase back in April, taken by his mother's phone and reworked somehow with skills he'd apparently only just learned, both of us laughing at something just out of frame, and on the back, in his same careful handwriting, it said, "The professor asked what the piece was about, and I told her it was about the year I almost gave up on people, and then didn't." I didn't have anything smart to say to that. I just hugged him right there on the platform, in front of both our very visibly delighted mothers, and Sophia, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan, said something to my mom in a low voice that I only caught the tail end of, something like, "I used to worry so much about him having no one." And my mom, without missing a beat, said, "Well, now he's got a whole extra family whether he likes it or not." And Mateo, overhearing, said, from inside the hug, "I like it, actually, quite a lot," which made both mothers dissolve into the specific kind of happy crying that mothers reserve for exactly these occasions. Senior year started that September with a version of Crestview High that felt, walking through the front doors again, subtly but unmistakably different. The way a room feels different after you've rearranged the furniture, even if you can't immediately name what moved. Chloe Peterson was still there, quieter now, no longer running for any student council position, spending most of her lunches with a small, gentler group of kids I didn't know well. And I noticed, more than once that fall, that she'd started actually stopping to help a table of freshmen who looked lost during the first week's schedule confusion. Small, unremarkable kindnesses that would have meant nothing from anyone else and meant something quietly significant coming from her, given everything. Owen had transferred his energy, somewhat hilariously, into the school's intramural volleyball league of all things, apparently discovering a genuine talent for it that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. And I saw him laugh, really laugh, unguarded, during a gym class scrimmage in October, in a way I don't think I'd ever once seen from him during all of junior year. And it struck me, watching it, that maybe some people just need the machinery of trying to be impressive to break down completely before whatever was underneath it gets a chance to breathe. Mateo and I, along with Anya, Marco, May, and Marco's cousin Alex, who had by that point become such a fixture at our lunch table that half the cafeteria assumed he'd always gone to our school, decided in September to enter the Regional Young Innovators Showcase together, a joint science and arts category the district had added that year specifically to encourage exactly the kind of collaboration that our particular friend group, half chemistry nerds and half art kids, happened to represent by pure accident. And we spent the entire fall building a project that combined my increasingly obsessive interest in chemistry, specifically a genuinely nerdy fascination with the way certain chemical reactions change color and texture as they age, with Mateo's photography, time-lapse documentation of controlled crystal growth under different light conditions, framed and printed as an actual gallery-style exhibit alongside the raw data, something neither of us could have built alone. Something that only existed because two entirely different kinds of attention to detail had found each other in a homeroom by pure accident of a 5-digit phone number typo a year and a half earlier. We spent 3 solid weekends in Mateo's kitchen, crystals growing in jars on newspaper spread across the counter, while Sophia, home for once on a rare Saturday off from both jobs, wandered through periodically offering unsolicited but weirdly excellent feedback on composition, and my dad, predictably, showed up one Sunday with an entire toolbox to help build the actual display stand. Because apparently every emotional milestone in my life since September of junior year had somehow required my father to construct something load-bearing. We placed second in the district showcase that November, losing only to a genuinely terrifying robotics team from the magnet school across town that had clearly had access to actual corporate sponsorship. And when they called our names for second place, Mateo grabbed my arm so hard I had a small bruise for 2 days. And backstage afterward, waiting for our certificate photo, he looked at the little printed ribbon in his hand and said quietly, half to himself, "We made something." And I said, "We did." And he said, "That's the first thing I've ever made with somebody else. Everything before this I made alone, in my room, for nobody." And I didn't have a smart response to that. I just bumped my shoulder against his the way he'd done to me outside that gym a year earlier. And he seemed to understand exactly what I meant by it, because he bumped back. That November also brought something I genuinely hadn't expected, which was a letter, an actual paper letter, mailed to our house from Ms. Castillo, addressed to me personally, which initially gave me a small jolt of anxious confusion until I opened it and found not a summons, but an invitation. The district was starting a new peer mentorship program the following spring, pairing older students with incoming freshmen who'd been flagged, gently, confidentially, as potentially vulnerable to exactly the kind of isolation that had once nearly swallowed both Mateo and me whole. And she was writing, she said, because in a full year of running that counselor's office, she had never once seen a friendship do more quiet, structural good for an entire grade's social climate than the one she'd watched form between the two of us. And she wanted to know if we'd both consider being among the very first mentors. I brought the letter to Mateo's kitchen that same afternoon, and he read it twice, very carefully, the way he read everything important, and then looked up at me and said, "So this is it? This is the actual full circle moment?" And I said, "I guess it is." And he said, "I have genuinely never wanted to say yes to anything faster in my entire life. And neither, it turned out, had I. The mentorship program launched that spring with a small, slightly awkward orientation session in the library, folding tables pushed together, a stack of name tags nobody wanted to wear, and a room full of nervous freshmen doing their absolute best to look like they hadn't been personally identified by the administration as socially at risk. A category of teenager who can smell condescension from 4 hallways away and will absolutely shut down entirely if a program feels even slightly like a punishment for being unpopular. Ms. Castillo, to her enormous credit, had clearly thought hard about how to avoid that exact trap, framing the whole thing not as remedial help, but as a kind of informal club. Casual lunches, no assigned worksheets, nothing that looked like an intervention. And Mateo and I were assigned, somewhat by luck and somewhat, I suspect, by Ms. Castillo's very deliberate matchmaking, to a freshman named Kai Kim. A quiet, watchful kid who spent that entire first meeting drawing tiny, intricate doodles in the margin of his orientation packet instead of making eye contact with anyone. Doodles that, when I finally got a glimpse of one, were genuinely, startlingly good. Better, honestly, than anything I could have managed at 14. Mateo noticed the doodles roughly 4 seconds after I did, and instead of saying anything about the program, or asking Kai the standard battery of getting-to-know-you questions that make freshmen want to disappear into the floor, he just slid his own sketchbook across the table, open to a half-finished dragon, and said, "What do you think? The wing proportions feel off to me, but I can't figure out why." And Kai, who I genuinely believe had not said 6 consecutive words to anyone outside his own family in the 2 weeks since school started, looked at that page for a long moment and then said, quietly but with real specific confidence, "The wings are too far forward. Dragons need the wing joint further back toward the hips, or the whole thing looks like it's about to faceplant." And Mateo, delighted, actually laughed out loud and said, "I knew it! I knew something was wrong." And just like that, over a genuinely nerdy conversation about dragon anatomy, the single most difficult first 5 minutes of the entire mentorship program simply dissolved. Kai, it turned out over the following weeks, had a story that rhymed with both of ours in a way that made my chest ache a little every time some new detail surfaced. A group of kids in his own grade who'd decided, for reasons as arbitrary and as unfair as Owen's wounded pride over a chemistry answer, that Kai's quietness made him an easy, safe target, a running joke in a chat he wasn't in, but had heard about secondhand from a cousin. The exact same architecture, I realized with a strange, cold recognition, rebuilding itself 1 grade behind us, the same way it apparently always had, generation after generation of teenagers rediscovering cruelty as though nobody had ever invented it before them. Except this time, for the first time in the entire history of that particular architecture at Crestview High, as far as either Mateo or I could determine, someone caught it early. We didn't need a phone number typo this time. We didn't need a folder of screenshots painstakingly built over a year of silent suffering. We just needed Kai, 3 weeks into the mentorship program, comfortable enough finally to admit out loud over lunch that he'd been avoiding the east stairwell because that's where they usually waited to make fun of his voice. And Mateo and I, without needing to discuss it, without needing a single dramatic plan, simply started walking Kai to his next class through the east stairwell every single day after that. Not confronting anyone, not making a scene, just being visibly, calmly present. 2 juniors with an established, if slightly infamous, reputation around school for surviving exactly this kind of thing. And it turns out that reputation, once earned, functions as a remarkably effective, entirely peaceful deterrent all on its own. Because within 2 weeks, according to Kai, the east stairwell jokes simply stopped happening, not because anyone got caught or punished, but because the small handful of kids running that particular joke apparently decided, quietly, on their own, that it wasn't worth the visibility of doing it in front of us. I thought about that a lot that spring, the strange, quiet power of simply being known. Being visibly, publicly, the kind of person certain behavior can't safely happen in front of, and how different that felt from the gym microphone revenge fantasy I used to run through my head. How much smaller and stranger and, ultimately, more useful it turned out to be than anything dramatic I could have engineered. Kai came out of his shell steadily over the rest of that year, joining the art club Mateo had quietly been running informal Thursday sessions for since October, and by May he'd made 2 actual friends his own age, Kids who liked dragons and didn't need Mateo or me at all anymore to feel safe in a hallway, which felt, when I really sat with it, like the actual finish line of the whole program. Not gratitude, not credit, just a kid who no longer needed us because he'd built something sturdy enough to stand on his own. Senior year, when it finally arrived, felt almost anticlimactic in the best possible sense. A whole year that mostly just happened the way a normal school year is supposed to happen. College applications, and mediocre cafeteria pizza, and Mateo's increasingly serious portfolio work for art school applications, and my own slow, surprising decision, somewhere around October, to apply to schools with strong chemistry programs after actually enjoying, for the first time, the specific kind of satisfaction that comes from building something real out of a subject I'd once only cared about because it happened to embarrass Owen Hayes in front of the wrong girl. We stayed close the whole year, obviously, our lunch table growing by exactly one more when Kai, now a sophomore, started occasionally crossing the grade divide to eat with us on days his own friends had a schedule conflict. A small, unremarkable detail that nonetheless made something in my chest go warm every single time it happened. Proof, walking and talking and eating cold cafeteria fries, that whatever had started with one accidental group chat invitation had actually, genuinely, propagated outward into something larger than the two of us who'd started it. Chloe graduated that June along with the rest of her original grade, a year ahead of us, and I heard, secondhand, through May, who'd stayed close with a few people from that old circle even after everything, that she'd ended up choosing a state school with a strong early childhood education program. A detail that landed on me with an odd, quiet weight when I first heard it, given the 20 hours of court-ordered community service that had, apparently, against every possible prediction, turned into something she actually loved doing. I don't know to this day whether that counts as a redemption arc or just a coincidence, a person finding, by accident, the one thing she turned out to be good at that had nothing to do with being feared, but I know that when May told me, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still slightly clenched. Some old leftover tension finally allowed to let go. Our own graduation, the following June, happened on a genuinely perfect evening. The kind of warm, golden, early summer light that Mateo had spent 4 years chasing across rooftops and rail yards. And I want to describe the specific moment that mattered most to me out of that whole ceremony, which had nothing to do with diplomas or speeches. Because right before we lined up alphabetically to process into the stadium, Mateo found me in the crowd of green gowns and mortarboards, slightly out of breath from having pushed through half the graduating class to reach me, and pressed something small and folded into my hand, the exact same gesture from that pep rally 2 years earlier. And I opened it standing there in that noisy, chaotic hallway of soon-to-be graduates, and it was another drawing, quick, confident lines, the two of us, recognizably, standing on a rooftop with a whole city spread out gold and hazy behind us. And underneath it, in handwriting I would know anywhere by now, it said, 4 years ago, a number typo saved my life, and I don't think you ever really knew that, so I'm telling you now in case I don't manage to say it properly later tonight. I did not, I will admit, make it through the actual graduation ceremony without crying at least twice. Once during the school orchestra's genuinely mediocre but earnest rendition of some inspirational instrumental piece, and once when they read Mateo's name for a scholarship to the art school he'd gotten into, the entire crowd of parents on our side of the stadium, our two families sitting shoulder to shoulder in the same folding chairs they'd occupied at that gallery showcase 2 years earlier, erupting into an amount of applause wildly disproportionate to what a scholarship announcement usually gets. Loud enough that Mateo, walking across that stage, had to visibly compose himself before shaking the principal's hand. Afterward, our whole extended lunch table, Anya, Marco, May, Alex, and Kai, who'd begged his own parents for permission to stay out late enough to join us, ended up back at the rail yard of all places, the same rusted, half-collapsed stretch of track where Mateo had first taught me the difference between a badly framed photo and a good one. Because somebody, I think it was Anya, had pointed out that it felt wrong to celebrate anywhere else, and we sat out there past midnight on overturned crates and the hood of Marco's ancient, wheezing car, passing around a cooler of soda his cousin had smuggled out of somebody's graduation party, talking about absolutely nothing in particular, which is, I've come to understand, the actual sound of a friendship that has fully, permanently arrived somewhere safe. Not dramatic conversation, just easy, overlapping nonsense. Alex doing an increasingly unhinged impression of our AP chemistry teacher, Kai showing off a new sketch on his phone that Mateo studied with the same careful, genuine attention he'd once given my terrible early photography attempts. May and Anya arguing cheerfully about which of two mediocre movies from that spring was actually worse. At some point, close to 1 in the morning, most of the group had drifted into smaller side conversations, and I found myself sitting slightly apart with Mateo on the same rusted railway car we'd shot that very first bad photograph on, 2 years and 1 whole lifetime ago. Both of us still in our slightly rumpled graduation clothes, ties loosened, looking out at the same stretch of scrap metal that had once looked, to my untrained eye, like a place you get tetanus, and now looked, after everything, like something closer to sacred ground. Mateo said, breaking a long, comfortable silence, "Do you ever think about how none of this happens without Chloe Peterson fat-fingering a spreadsheet?" And I laughed, because it was true, and because it was exactly the kind of thing only Mateo would say out loud at 1 in the morning on the night of our own graduation. And I said, "I think about it constantly, actually. It's genuinely deranged when you sit with it. An entire friendship, an entire different version of both our lives, hinging on one wrong keystroke." And Mateo said quietly, "I used to think the black heart thing was the bravest thing I ever did, sitting silently in that chat for a year just so I'd have proof if it ever got bad enough to matter." And I said, "It was brave." And he said, "No, listen, I don't think it was. Not really, because it never actually changed anything on its own. It just sat there, quiet, unused, for a whole year. And the actual brave thing, the thing that mattered, was you noticing it, and then doing something about it. Because a witness who never gets found is just a guy alone in a room keeping a diary nobody reads." I didn't have a smart answer for that either, so I just sat with it, letting it settle the way the important things Mateo said always eventually settled into something I understood a little better the longer I held on to it. And eventually I said, "So what do we do with it now? The noticing thing, now that we're about to go be freshmen again at 2 different schools," and Mateo, looking out at the rail yard instead of at me, said, "We just keep doing it, I think, wherever we end up, because it turns out it's not actually that complicated. You just have to be willing to be the one person in the room who admits, out loud, that the joke isn't actually funny. And most people, it turns out, are just waiting for someone else to say it first." We moved out that August, 3 weeks apart. Mateo heading 5 hours north to the art school he'd chosen partly, he admitted with a slightly sheepish grin, because their photography program had a darkroom with genuinely excellent natural light in the afternoons. And me, heading 2 states over to a mid-sized university with the kind of chemistry department my guidance counselor had described, memorably, as producing more patent filings per capita than anywhere else in the region, a sentence that would have meant absolutely nothing to the version of me standing in that auditorium 2 years earlier, scrolling through a group chat in the dark, and meant everything to the version of me packing up a dorm room with my dad, who insisted, naturally, on personally supervising the assembly of a bookshelf that did not, strictly speaking, need supervising. Mateo and I said goodbye to each other in his driveway the weekend before move-in, both of our cars loaded down with the specific chaotic overflow of 18 years of accumulated belongings, and neither of us made a big speech about it, because by that point, we'd both quietly understood, without ever needing to say it directly, that this particular friendship had long since stopped being the kind of thing that required grand gestures to survive a little distance. It had survived 6 weeks of an arts program the summer after junior year. It had survived an entire pandemic of ordinary teenage distraction and homework and heartbreak over other smaller things, and 5 hours of highway was not going to be the thing that finally broke it. He did, however, hand me one last folded square of paper before I got in the car. A habit by now so established between us that I'd started keeping a specific drawer just for them, and I didn't open it until I was already 3 hours into the drive, pulled over at a rest stop while my dad refilled the tank. And it was a simple pencil sketch, nothing elaborate, just a small black heart, the exact shape from that very first avatar. And underneath it, in handwriting I could probably recognize now with my eyes closed, it said, "Your turn." I didn't fully understand what he meant by that until about 6 weeks into my first semester, sitting in a dorm common room on a Tuesday night that felt, in a way that gave me an unpleasant little jolt of recognition, uncomfortably similar to another Tuesday 2 years earlier. My hall had a group chat, obviously, every hall does, mostly used for coordinating laundry room drama and complaining about the dining hall's inexplicable devotion to serving fish on Wednesdays. And that particular night it had turned, the way these things always seem to turn, toward a kid down the hall named Zara Singh, a quiet freshman from 3 doors down who'd made the mistake, apparently, of crying audibly enough during a homesick phone call that somebody in the room next door had heard it through the wall and decided it was hilarious content for the group chat. A screenshot of a half-joking, half-cruel message already circulating by the time I opened my phone. Something about, "Hall baby needs her mommy." 3 separate laughing face reactions already stacked underneath it before I'd even finished reading. I sat there on my dorm bed for a long moment, feeling that old, familiar cold drop in my stomach. Except this time it wasn't fear. It was recognition. The specific, sickening sense of watching a pattern I knew intimately from the inside starting to assemble itself in a brand new location with brand new people who had absolutely no idea it had a name, a shape, a whole prior history I could have drawn them a diagram of if they'd asked. I thought about Mateo's note, still taped to the inside cover of my chemistry notebook by that point. "Your turn." And I thought about the folder labeled School Photos, 2024. And I thought about a silent gray avatar sitting patiently in a chat for a full year, waiting for someone to actually notice. And I did the only thing I could think to do, the small, unglamorous, entirely undramatic thing that had ended up mattering more than any gym microphone speech ever could have. I typed into that hallway group chat, in plain, unhidden text under my own actual name. "Hey, not cool. Zara's allowed to have a rough night. We've all had one." And I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. And I sat there afterward with my heart going in that same old anxious rhythm, half expecting the chat to turn on me instead. And what actually happened was quieter and stranger than either outcome I'd braced for. A long pause, 3 dots appearing and disappearing twice, and then, one by one, over the next 10 minutes, 4 other people, kids I barely knew yet, kids who'd probably been sitting exactly as uncomfortably silent as I once used to sit, chimed in with their own small, unpolished versions of the same sentiment. "Yeah, that's kind of messed up, actually, and leave her alone, man." And the original message, without anyone deleting it, without any drama at all, simply stopped being funny, buried under an avalanche of people who'd apparently just needed one person to go first. I called Mateo that same night, late enough that he picked up on the 4th ring sounding half asleep, and I told him the whole thing. The message, the dorm hallway, Zara's name, all of it. And there was a long pause on the line after I finished, and then Mateo said, in a voice thick with something that took me a second to place as him actually being emotional about it, "That's it. That's exactly it. That's the whole thing I was trying to say with the note." And I said, "I know, I got it. It just took a hallway full of strangers crying about fish night for it to click." And he laughed, properly laughed. The specific unguarded laugh I'd first heard over a bad joke about my own bathroom crying schedule 2 years earlier, and said, "So are you going to actually talk to her? Or are we just going to let this be a nice story you tell people at parties someday?" And I said, "Obviously I'm going to talk to her." And he said, "Good. Tell her the fish thing gets better after October. They switched to some kind of pasta rotation. I looked it up." And I said, "Did you actually research my dining hall menu?" And he said, "I looked up several things about your school before you left. I wanted to make sure it seemed like a place you'd actually be okay," which is such a specifically, quietly Mateo thing to admit that I didn't say anything for a second, just sat there on my dorm room floor with the phone against my ear feeling, not for the first time that year, an almost embarrassing amount of gratitude for one accidental phone number typo. I did talk to Zara the next morning, awkwardly, over the dining hall's admittedly excellent Wednesday something that wasn't fish, introducing myself properly for basically the first time, despite 3 doors and 6 weeks of proximity, and told her, in slightly less detail than I've told you, that I knew exactly what that kind of hallway felt like, and that if she ever wanted actual company instead of a group chat's worth of unsolicited opinions, my door was always open. And she looked at me for a long moment with an expression I recognized instantly. The specific, wary hope of someone who has learned not to trust kindness until it's proven itself at least once, and said, quietly, That would actually be really nice. And by the end of that semester, she'd become, without either of us planning it, one of the steadiest friendships of my entire freshman year. The kind of friendship that starts, as it turns out, an unusual number of the best ones do, with somebody noticing a cruelty in progress and simply refusing to let it pass by unremarked. I think about that a lot now, looking back on the whole strange arc of it. The soup video and the group chat and the black heart and the gopher shuffle and the gallery showcase and the mentorshipping program and a dorm room hallway 3 states away from where the entire thing started. And what strikes me most, more than any single dramatic moment, is how little of it actually required the thing I spent so long fantasizing about in the dark at 11 at night. Some grand, cinematic reckoning where the villain finally gets what's coming to her in front of a crowd. Chloe Peterson never knelt down and begged for forgiveness. Nobody's family got bankrupted. Nobody got publicly, spectacularly destroyed in the way every single one of those old fantasies used to promise me they would. What actually happened, when I trace it all the way back, was smaller, slower, and much, much stranger. A phone number 1 digit off from another kid's, a small black heart drawn quietly in the corner of a sketchbook page, a boy in a foam gopher costume finding the nerve to dance in front of 400 people, a folded note passed hand to hand at a bus station, a hallway full of strangers 3 states from home deciding, together, on the spot, that a joke about a homesick freshman simply wasn't funny anymore. None of it looked like revenge. All of it, somehow, felt like winning anyway. I'm writing this down now, all the way at the end, from a genuinely unglamorous folding chair in the back corner of a small gallery in the city where Mateo lives now, 6 years after that first Tuesday, waiting for his opening night to actually start, because he asked me, with the same careful, direct bluntness he's had since homeroom junior year, whether I'd be willing to write something for the little printed program handed out at the door. Something about how we met, since apparently enough people at these things ask him the story that he got tired of telling the short version and wanted, for once, the long one written down properly. Mateo is, for what it's worth, doing exactly what 18-year-old him would have wanted, shooting for 2 different magazines and building toward his first proper solo show. This one, tonight, a whole room of framed prints that trace, chronologically, without either of us planning it that way when we started shooting together, almost the entire span of our friendship. The rail yard, the rooftop portrait with its little placard, a photograph from the Young Innovators Showcase, one from graduation night at that same rail yard in our rumpled gowns, and a final one, shot just last spring, of the 2 of us on a different rooftop entirely, older now, laughing at something the camera caught mid-motion, blurred just slightly at the edges in a way Mateo insisted on keeping instead of reshooting, because, in his exact words, some things are better a little imperfect and moving than perfectly, coldly still. I'm getting a text right now, actually, while I sit here writing this, and it's from Kai, 20 years old now, 3 years into his own art degree, letting me know he can't make it tonight because of a final review, but that he's sending Mateo the good luck he deserves. And one from Lily, 22 and finishing a psychology degree with, unsurprisingly, a specific research focus on adolescent social dynamics that she insists, only half joking, she owes entirely to a single dinner table conversation about a kid named Oscar. And one from my own phone's group chat with Anya, Marco, and May, who are somewhere in this same city tonight, running slightly late, promising to bring the good snacks this time, unlike literally every single gathering for the last 6 years. I think, sitting here in this folding chair, about that auditorium 2 years into a story that has since stretched into 6, scrolling through a group chat in the dark, convinced I had just discovered the worst thing that would ever happen to me. And I think about how impossible it would have been, back then, soup drying on my shirt, and a poll counting down the days until my breakdown circulating among people I thought were my friends, to believe that the actual ending of that story was a gallery opening on a warm evening. A room full of people who love each other. A folded note taped inside a chemistry notebook that says, "Your turn." And a small black heart, quiet and gray, and easy to miss if you're not looking for it. That somehow, against every single terrible odd, turned out to be the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to either of us. My name is still Leo Miller. I still, occasionally, correct people when they're wrong about chemistry, though I've gotten marginally better at reading the room first. And somewhere, in a group chat I'm not even in, on a hallway I'll probably never walk down, There's a decent chance right now that some quiet kid nobody's noticing yet is sitting silently, watching something cruel scroll past, deciding, on their own, without any instructions from anyone, that they're not going to laugh along, that they're going to remember it instead, that someday, if they're lucky, somebody's going to notice, and it's going to be the start of something they can't yet imagine. I hope somebody does. I hope it's soon. And if it's you, whoever's reading this, sitting in your own version of that auditorium, with your own version of that chat open in the dark, I want you to know, from someone who's already made it all the way through to the other side of it, that the black heart is never the whole story. It's just the first sentence of one. The rest is up to whoever finds the courage to read it.